Good morning.
Good morning.
So yesterday, I met a guy who worked for TikTok, and we just had a few minutes together. But I just asked him, so
where did you meet him?
Do you guys? It was kind of a sometime about that. No, every once in a while, I started this last year. Every once in a while, I'll drive for Uber for fun. It's not really a good source of income, but it's like a fun thing to do where I can clear my head a little bit and still make some money and meet a bunch of interesting people. And so yesterday I had these two guys in my car. One they were both like heading from one bar to the other, and one of them worked for TikTok, and I just asked him, like, so do you guys ever talk about potential ban in the company? Like, is there any official word? Like, what's going on there? He's like, no, it's so weird. Like, I keep seeing the headlines, but no one ever says anything. And I'm over here thinking, will I still have a job next month? You know? So, yeah.
Were they here for South by Southwest?
No, they were both living in Austin. So,
okay.
Yeah.
Well, they may be relocated to China. TikTok gets
they just have to move, yeah.
It's like, you have a job, but it's over here.
Talking about South by Southwest, like 5 people were from SVB on the panel. So I think that will be cancelled. Their speeches.
No way.
Yeah.
Which panel?
I forgot something about fintech startups.
And how great they are at their job.
Like a lot of SVB people.
That is so weird. I mean, maybe we can quickly recap like what we know about this, right?
About what SVB?
Like, what's happening right now, right? So we're sitting here Saturday morning, March 11th, and the news broke, I guess, like 2 days ago or so that Silicon Valley Bank is shutting down operation. People were unable to get their funds out. And apparently half of all venture-backed startups,
something like that,
bank with this bank, and also venture capitalists have their funds oftentimes sitting in the bank.
There's a collaboration between SVB and Y Combinator companies too. There's a big correlation there as well.
I think a third of YC companies were banking with SVB. Yeah.
Wow.
And what was the?
Okay. There's some vacuuming going on outside.
We're still warming up.
I was just making sure there's not some weird.
So I read this blog post yesterday by Noah Smith, which I shared on my Twitter, and it's awesome. He explains it so well, like the bank run, the collapse, and why it happened.
Yeah.
One of the reasons of why it happened is that Peter Thiel, of course, who else, advised his portfolio companies to withdraw funding. And because Peter Thiel is a prominent venture capitalist, it was a domino effect, and everyone else started withdrawing funding because they were worried about their solvency. And another reason is that a lot of their assets were in like long-term, mortgages and so on, and so they were very illiquid. And because interest rates were rising, their assets, the value of their assets was falling down because interest rates rise, prices fall of bonds. And so, they couldn't meet the withdrawals from their clients, and they had to shut down. Now, what are the next steps? Like, what's going to happen next? All these startups that need to pay employees, that need to cover their expenses, have no money. Are they going to rely on their venture capital funds that are struggling themselves? It's a tech bust. It's not a great time for the venture capital scene. What's gonna happen?
Yeah, it's wild.
Yeah,
it's wild. This is one of these things where it might make sense for the government to step in.
Ooh.
Right? And we can go into that a little bit.
Too big to fail.
But I heard someone say this yesterday. If you had to pick a bank with a worse name to save, for public opinion, call it Silicon Valley.
right. Federal funds going to one place.
Yeah. They don't have enough money. They need taxpayers.
Yeah. Just a little guy.
So, but I definitely see the argument that if you go through these second and third order effects of companies becoming insolvent, having to or missing payrolls, and I think there's also then federal laws that kick in, where they actually then have to either furlough or lay off people. I'm not sure about the details there. And it would trigger this mass layoff, right? That's one of the instances where I would actually support the government to come in, to do it on the short term to kind of backstop the thing, but do it for conditions where they would either get repaid with interest or get a big equity portion of the bank, or any way where the government actually then has some control in the end and actually can profit from it, but kind of saves the situation.
I think what's likely to happen is that this will be a big red flag for the Fed, because the Fed is going to be raising interest rates until people start experiencing pain. So whether the federal government steps in or not, this is one of those situations where, okay, clearly this could have a big impact and a big downstream effect where a lot of people lose their jobs. So rather than a 0.5% hike, I think it's going to maybe be more like a 0.25% hike, or maybe even a 0 at the end of the month. And because this is the kind of pain that people are talking about. And it's been pretty strong economy still, but there could be some downstream effects that change the policy of the Fed in the short term.
Yeah.
I think a likely scenario is that SVB will be bought out by one of the large banks, JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, right? They will take over their assets and the deposit accounts, and I think people shouldn't panic, right? Just relax, take the $250K from the government. I think that's like the what is it called? Advance payment that the government is offering to the customers.
I think that comes from this insurance. It's called the
insurance,
FDIC insurance that covers 250,000
Yeah.
of each account if that account falls under that. So that any of our personal checking accounts will be usually covered by that. Yeah.
Yeah, and that should cover payroll for the next week or two for most startups, I hope, before things get sorted.
But it is kind of interesting the role that panic played in that, right? Because, one guy says, move your assets out.
Yeah.
And whatever he knew, caused a downstream effect.
Yeah.
So what's to prevent that from happening again?
And people assume Peter Thiel knows everything.
Yeah.
Right.
He's the guy who knows everything. So, yeah, like the panic is real. Yeah. And the good thing is that SVB's assets were not tied to the large banks, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like in 2008, it was completely a different game where, Lehman Brothers, Bank of America, Merrill Lynch, they were all tied together when it comes to their obligations and CDOs. So SVB was kind of different from that respect, that, it was a niche bank, say.
Yeah. It was weird thinking about 2008. I was in Germany at the time and was only loosely following what's going on. And, I wasn't in the financial industry and still a student, but it even trickled down all the way to Germany where Germans like to save money and not do risky investments, but they somehow, a lot of the banks in Germany convinced their customers to put their money into funds and a little bit more risky investments. And then that got bought and sold and repackaged, and it wasn't really openly communicated where the money went and what the risk, what the risk panel is. And a lot of retirees lost a lot of money, right? And it was very unpleasant and very surprising, right? That one bank thing caused that, even across the world. Yeah.
Crazy. Yeah. Cool. Shall we do introduction?
Sure, let's do it.
Yeah.
Okay, so episode 47 is a special one with my friends Emanuel Lissek and Aaron Foote. We'll cover lots of topics that Emanuel and Aaron disagree on, from politics to the recent evidence relating to the January 6th events, mental health, free speech, and other controversial and non-controversial topics. Emanuel and Aaron met while pursuing their PhD in physics at UT Austin. Do you guys want to intro yourselves?
Sure, I can start. Yeah, good morning, and thank you for having us, and thank you, Aaron, for being here. This is only my second podcast I've ever done, so it's fun, but I like talking about a lot of these things. So, quick story, like who am I and how did I end up here? I actually grew up in Germany, and the very first time I came to the U.S. was for a high school exchange. My dad at the time suggested to me, "Oh, you should learn English better, and why don't you go to this program?" Next thing I know, I'm sitting on an airplane by myself at age 15 going to the US.
Which year was it?
That was 2004. Huh. Yeah, so a while ago. And I ended up in Austin with staying with a family that took me in for 10 months, attending high school, and it's very fascinating, kind of this positive culture shock, right, that brought me to the new world. And since then, I always wanted to come back. And made it then in 2012, where I got into UT for a PhD program in physics, and then moved here back to Austin, and then been in the US ever since. So after the PhD program, which ended in 2018, I joined a biotech company and very quickly moved into a little bit different than the basic research. I moved to a sales team of a company that was selling microscopes. So I was kind of at this interface of business and science, which was really a great experience. Left that job last year, and right now doing sales for a startup, and also kind of becoming part of the startup community and meeting a lot of people, and working on some ideas of my own. So that's my brief story right now.
So you're almost the OG here in Austin. Like, you were here in 2004.
Yeah, for the very first time.
That's like 19 years ago.
Well, thanks for reminding me.
How old were you in 2004?
I was 15 at
15,
the time.
yeah, okay. Well, you probably didn't like go out and like explore Austin all that much.
A little bit, yeah. No. I had to. It was actually interesting because in Germany we started drinking way too early, and you know that I drank alcohol at the time in Germany, and I had to come over here, and I stopped for obvious
for like
reasons.
6 years.
And I stopped. I was smoking cigarettes at the time too. These are not my proudest moments, but.
And you stopped.
And I stopped too, and then started once I got back to Germany. But that's a different story. But yeah, it's you know, it's fascinating. Even 2012, right? Austin was a completely different city.
How was it different? Explain.
How was it different? Just it was obviously much smaller. You know, less high rises, more of. This is an interesting observation that I'm making more recently, is that Austin is losing some of the southern charm that Texas is so proud of. Mm-hmm. And you know, Aaron can probably speak to that more as a true Texan, but you know, Texas is like very welcoming and warm, and people help each other, and everyone talks to you on the street, and we're kind of losing that right now, right? Just this morning I was taking a walk with my wife, and I noted how like everyone was just with their headphones and their dogs and not looking at anyone else, and you know,
that might be a 21st century thing, not a Texan thing.
Yeah, true. But Austin kept that for a long time, I feel like. And other parts of Texas still have that.
Sure.
Yeah. So.
Do you feel the same, Aaron?
Well, I got here in 2013, and so maybe that 1 year made a big difference in terms of the culture shock.
Maybe.
But I don't know. I don't know if I would necessarily say that. I would say that it's gotten a lot more tech oriented and a lot more modern. And I do agree that it's lost some of that southern hospitality, which is part of the reason why a lot of people move here. And I think it's interesting how, you know, Austin has a reputation of being, you know, a blue oasis in an ocean of red politically. And so if you live in one of the coasts and you tend to want to, you know, live in a more liberal city, but you want to go to somewhere that has a more favorable tax treatment, then Austin really stands out as a good place. And so that, I think, has definitely increased over the last few years. You get a lot of people moving from California and from New York and from Chicago. And so that's changed the city in quite a few ways, and that's been pretty noticeable.
Yeah.
Do you want to introduce yourself?
Oh, sure, we can do that part. So my name is Aaron, and I grew up in Houston, Texas, and I was raised there from ages 0 to 18. I didn't have any cross Atlantic excursions at the age of 15, unlike Emanuel. So I've always been interested in several things, but my interests have primarily been in science and then also in history. And so when I went to college, I was one class away from getting a double major in history, but my primary focus was always in physics. And I really liked the approach of physics when applied to solving biological problems. And so when I came to UT, I was here to get a PhD in biophysics, which is where I met Emanuel. And then now, after graduating in 2019, I've been working at a biotech startup here in town as a director, but really primarily as a scientist, even though I direct a couple of different projects. And I still have that role, and I very much enjoy it, and I like the interdisciplinary approach to science. But as a fun little hobby, I've definitely kept up my history reading, and I really enjoy American history in particular, but also politics and controversial topics, which is, I think, how I got invited to this particular podcast. But I do want to say that, you know, Emanuel and I met in 2013 when I moved to Austin for graduate school, and I met this guy, and he seemed like a standard German socialist liberal, and growing up in Houston, Texas, and I've always kind of leaned a little bit to the right, and I enjoy politics, and then I find this guy, and he turns out to be, you know, a super vegan, And so I'm
super
like,
vegan,
yeah.
socialist. Oh my God.
Yeah, and so I'm like, I mean, I know I could work with the guy, but I said, well, you know what, Emanuel, we're going to be working together for 5 years in the same little tiny office in graduate school. And I bet by the end of those 5 years, you're going to be a little more conservative. I'm going to be a little more vegan. And I think that's happened. I think Emanuel is much more conservative than he was when I met him. And I got to admit that sometimes I drink soy milk. So I think it went a little both ways.
Can't be avoided.
Yeah, and so I think during the course of this conversation, we'll see that there's going to be topics we disagree on, but there's also quite a few that we agree, and so I'm excited to see how that plays out.
So which one do you want to start discussing, politics or soy milk?
Okay, well, politics is much more interesting, I think, for the audience. Plus, soy milk, Emmanuel's going to be the one that talks the most of the time.
But I love this. Like, you're kind of describing a kind of slow long-term evolution that I've undergone over the last few years.
Meanwhile, I've stayed constant because I knew the right answer from the beginning.
There you go. No, but I've always, and that's something that I try to maintain, and sometimes it's hard, but I try to maintain some openness around topics that I believe in, and like I have opinions on a lot of things, but keeping some space open, that's a little bit away from the topic, knowing that maybe I'm wrong, right? Maybe I'm completely wrong. And usually there's a group of people that would claim that, and they practice a completely different lifestyle. And maybe there's some truth to their ways of living and their belief system as well. And, who am I to think that I've got it figured out, right?
Right.
But that doesn't make my opinion less valid, I think. I still have a certain path that I would like to go down, and I would like to see the world go down in certain topics. But why I'm talking about this, so I definitely learned a lot from you, and I appreciate that. So
well, I learned a lot. I enjoy political discussions in general, so it's always good to flesh out ideas and get attacked in different ways and see what the real accurate truth that kind of wins out from this free discourse of information, and that's the way it should be.
Yeah.
And I agree, people should be open-minded and always think about, I believe this way about whatever topic, but what piece of information would change my mind? What piece of evidence or new information would come to light that would make me think about, maybe this isn't the right approach, or what data set would have to be there. And we're both scientists by training, and so we kind of like to look.
You got to be skeptical,
right? You like to look at numbers. You like to be a little skeptical, and you have your beliefs, and you're willing to defend them. But there's always that guy at the conference who raises his hand and just completely shoots down your presentation. And our boss was like that in graduate school.
Yeah.
And so you got to keep an eye out for that, because that can change your perspective on everything.
Yeah, and they usually have a point.
Yeah, they often have a point. Unfortunately,
it's hard to be proven wrong publicly. You see that on Twitter. A lot of people will just defend their viewpoint no matter what, even though personally they may actually shift their opinion. Mm-hmm. So it's an interesting game. Yeah.
Because they identify with the viewpoint, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Because when a certain viewpoint becomes your identity, and I've kind of experienced this myself. So I became a vegan in actually 2014.
You're vegan? Really?
Yeah. You guys have heard of veganism? So I decided to
Explain.
go. I've decided to go. I just don't like to kill living beings. That's it. That's pretty much it. Very simple.
It's very controversial.
So I know. No, but I decided to. You got
sick of Texas barbecue?
I decided.
I'm not sure if he's ever tried it.
I have. Back
in less proud moments.
Years. Yes. But honestly, as a side point, I never got the draw to barbecue. Even if when I still ate meat, it just doesn't taste like much.
So speaking of
it's
controversial topics,
gives it all
Emanuel comes out bashing Texan barbecue.
Doesn't taste like much.
It doesn't taste like much. And
I thought we were going to get mad at more complicated issues here.
But coming back, so I decided to go fully vegan in 2014, and then I went through this kind of initial phase for a few years that I guess a lot of people in this community go through, where I really started identifying with being a vegan, and that became a big part of my identity, meaning I want to tell everyone about it, and I'm very passionate about it. I read books, I watch documentaries, I go to conferences, and everyone around me, I just want to grab them and shake them, like, wake up, like, why don't you know about this, right?
So what turned you vegan in the first place? Was it killing of animals, or was it the health benefits? like
Never
your
the
scientific
health.
pursuit of truth.
Never the health.
Never the health.
So this particular topic for me is was not really scientifically motivated. I did a lot of research then into what do we know about this lifestyle and what does it do to your health and so on. But the initial motivation, actually, I have to credit a lot of that to my mother, who was a vegetarian for almost her entire life. She turned a vegetarian in her 20s, which must have been in the early 80s, I guess, and in Germany, coming from Bavaria, which I call it's funny. Bavaria is a state of Germany. I call
Western Germany.
Yes, it's in the south part. Actually. It's in Western Germany if you're talking about the division, but it's in the south. Yes, yeah. So, but I call Bavaria the Texas of Germany because it tends to be more conservative and proud of being Bavarian over German for no particular reason.
Would you try
there's
a
lot
barbecue
of
too?
And they speak in a weird dialect that no one can understand. So no, but I have a lot of love for for all of them. But anyway, so my mom, growing up in that environment, turned vegetarian for her love of animals, and then was vegetarian while she was pregnant with me, and actually raised me and my siblings vegetarian. And so that was always like, a part of me growing up. And then I ate meat for a long time, but then in college I kind of came back to it. And started thinking about what does it actually mean to eat meat, what has to go into it, and started informing myself about factory farming, all the practices surrounding that, started thinking through this as an ethical issue, and then trying to decide, is this something I can live with, to support that with my actions, which is really the only thing I have immediate control over. And then finally made a decision to stop doing that, which was difficult a little bit because there's a lot of you have to go against some social conventions and you have to deal with some first world inconveniences, but it's still easy enough to actually do. So where I'm actually was trying to get to is, in those initial years after making the decision, I very much identified with it, right? And that's something in the more recent past I've stepped away from a little bit. It's still a very important part of my values and my belief system, but I've come to realize that a lot of good people have a completely different opinion about this and practice differently, and they're not bad people because of it. I still wish they would agree with me, but I can accept that more readily, and it's not as big as an offense to my identity anymore when someone has a different opinion.
So I'll play off that a little bit. So this might be relevant to later topics in the conversation. But part of the reason that you like to be a vegan, right? And once you educated yourself and you learned about all the ethics, you felt that this is a superior way of living, right? That if people really knew what you knew, then they would follow in a similar path.
That's
right. And so I think that's how a lot of people feel about whatever topic.
Right.
They learn a little bit about some topic, and then therefore they say, "Oh, this is clearly a better way to think, to live, to act, to behave, whatever it is." But one contrast that I think I'm going to draw with Emanuel versus what we hear about sort of in the political sphere is that there's a lot of talk about people advocating for virtuous causes, and they say, "Oh, if you really educated yourself, this is how you would think, or this is how you would believe." But a lot of people think that while taking no action in order to actually follow that particular belief. Maybe they may make certain points in a political conversation, but they don't have to go through social pressures. They don't have to go to a restaurant and not be able to order what they want. I mean, I know that's not a huge sacrifice, but one thing in Emanuel's case that I really want to advocate, I've known him for a long time, and this guy really walks the walk when it comes to veganism. And so I think that saying that this is a belief that you have that you think is the way to live, but you really practice what you preach, I think is an important difference from a lot of people who talk about different political topics, and they kind of say, oh, everyone knows that that's the right way to be at no cost to themselves. And so someone who's really sacrificed in order to sort of maintain those beliefs, I think that combination makes him a little different in some other ways.
Thank you.
Whatever.
But I think, in Emanuel's case, he's a vegan because of the ethical reasons, right? A lot of people in Hollywood especially are vegan because it's cool, right? It's the culture. Like it's, and they, maybe believe that it's healthier, but I think it's mainly because, that's what everyone is doing in Hollywood. They don't have any particular reasons. They haven't done any research, right? They just do what other people are doing.
I think we should pay less attention to Hollywood.
I think so too.
I think Hollywood disagrees.
I've seen this TikTok video of, who was it? Alicia Keys, the singer. Mm-hmm. She's like, I'm gonna make this vegan banana bread. Okay, let's get some eggs.
Step one.
Let's get some vegan butter. So yeah.
I love this. Yeah, this reminds me of this completely.
You gotta educate everyone.
Yeah. Yeah, you're describing just a social trend, right? And people wanting to belong.
And this I find really interesting. So it's really common for people to say, look back in periods of history, pick your horrible period, whatever it is, and then they say, if I was there during that time, I know I wouldn't be a Nazi. I know I wouldn't be, whatever it is. And I always find that so interesting because you don't. You really don't unless you are actually there, and then you have to look at your own life and think about times in which you went against the culture that entirely surrounded you. And I think the people that think that they would have acted differently, first of all, they don't know the answer, but then you look at them and you say, well, what do you believe? What do you say? How many people do you disagree with? Who do you push back on? And what personal sacrifices do you make by making those claims? Yeah. And unless you're really putting your money where your mouth is, then I don't really believe you.
That's
a great point.
It is so hard. Yeah. And I hate to make this segue, but
oh boy,
this reminds me very much of something that has happened in the last 2 years with the COVID vaccination.
There it is.
There.
All right, after that brief censorship attempt by big tech.
Yes, I said
vaccinations.
Just our equipment went out immediately. It's really strange. We're sitting here in 2023, I think. It's for the record, anyone watching this. But so as I was saying, I hate to make this segue, but
no, you don't.
You know what? I don't. I think it's actually very important to discuss. But what happened the last few years with COVID vaccinations, where we can get into that in a little bit more detail, but obviously COVID, whatever happened there happened, and we can discuss that. But then the proposed solution was vaccinating everyone, and then it went from something hopeful as the solution to the suggested solution to the kind of more than suggested, actually everyone should be doing it, to no, you actually have to do it, and to if you don't do it, you can't go to a restaurant anymore, you can't work your job anymore, and in fact you're actually also a murderer, because if you don't do it, you kill grandmother and you're getting other people sick, and you should be really shunned from society.
Yeah, so for you ethically it all works out, because you're a vegan, but then also
oh my god, and I don't know,
vegan murderer,
maybe kind of balances that's what I'm saying, always striving for the net positive in life, right?
Yeah, so just a little above average.
So, and I think it relates to this topic because, and this is bringing me to one of my stats here. I believe 91% it is of the United States population at this point have received at least one shot of the COVID vaccine, and that is almost everyone, right? But still, it's a significant number of people that, for one reason or the other, decided this is not for me, and they were able to withstand and tolerate not only the social pressure, but also, it went into economic, financial pressures that are, even if you withstand the social pressure, then that's a whole nother level, right? So.
But I think the reason why 91% of people did get vaccinated is because we thought the virus was deadly. It was super contagious, right? It was. So
there's competing forces, right? There's the fact that yes, the virus was incredible or was deadly, but we also didn't know how deadly, right? So the first instinct is panic, right? We don't know this thing. We don't know how bad it's going to be. We don't know what the fatality rates are. So that definitely impacted people's decision making. And another thing is that in general, the vaccines were quite effective, right? And there's a couple things about the vaccine that we found out later that maybe weren't so good. But in terms of actually preventing your ability to, or preventing the chance of you having some sort of complications. Like, they were really effective in that way. But one thing that I would say to Emanuel's point is the whole idea, which was the foundation of the vaccine mandate, was that if you get vaccinated, you're less likely to transport it to, or transmit it to other people. That was scientifically quite flawed. And so when you have the public panic coincide with the way science works, which is you don't know a lot about something and then you learn and you learn and you learn, that sort of consolidated that process to, rather than say, we recommend that you get the vaccine because of these reasons and we're learning more every day, it was more like, we know everything and this is what we're going to make you do. Now, a recent study a couple months ago found out that Pfizer didn't actually really have a lot of data to suggest that it actually prevents transmission to other people, which was the foundational principle for why the federal government was trying to get everyone vaccinated. And if it was true, it makes some sense. Constitutionally, still very difficult to implement, and there's a big issue there. But without the data to back it up, that's concrete. Very, very sketchy in terms of how the scientific process should work, even in a public policy perspective, even with that big influx of panic. Not only that, you've got people like Cuomo, the governor of New York, who clearly messed up early on in the COVID scare and everything. And the thing that I find so funny about him is that by, what was it that he did exactly? He basically took a lot of people in retirement homes and forced them to stay in retirement homes and sort of not encouraged on purpose, but created a situation in which it was more likely for them to die. And he got some public backlash.
Well, he wanted to isolate them so that they wouldn't die.
Right, and then
they died.
Yeah, right. And
he forced sick elderly people to stay in the retirement home, right?
Correct.
Yeah, so that the rest of the society could function.
Yeah, but which killed everyone in the retirement home.
Correct.
Yeah.
But the thing I find so funny about that is that's not what kicked him out of his governorship.
Yeah. It's very sad. Yeah.
Which seems like, in terms of a governor where you're supposed to, act in the best interests of the people you represent, that seems like a death sentence. But that's not what did it. Yeah. So I just find that very interesting.
Yeah, it's very sad. But, I disagree with some things that you said along the way there. I think it's even hard to decide on which level to discuss this. But in a way, it's like the coming together of a government that is or has been bought over the years by a lot of corporate interests, also from the pharmaceutical side.
Cynical.
And a pharmaceutical industry and biotechnology industry that, well, obviously wants to make money, and there's nothing wrong with that, but sometimes likes to overlook negative signals, and there's a long track record of pharmaceutical companies getting sued and having to pay for that. But they also had a big interest to push this mRNA technology as a platform because and I'm speculating here, but it promised big payouts in the future because it can serve as a platform for multiple different vaccines and makes development easier. And so there were a lot of these things coming together to make the perfect storm and to cause us to go down a direction that I think we should have never gone down.
Which direction is that specifically?
To approve a vaccine in this record time based on little data, and then push it into the vast population, and kind of take into account all the negative effects with that. There are a lot of negative effects happening right now. The data for that is hard to come by, and it's going to take decades for us to work through that.
So I will say it's not like they started from zero and then in the span of a year had an mRNA vaccine. I mean, that technology has been researched for a long time. Right. You're correct to say for this particular vaccine, what is it like to have it for 30 years? We don't know because it hasn't been available for 30 years. And so that's a valid point. But to say that there's only been studies where they've studied it in a short period of time is a little bit misleading, because the technology has been known for some time, and other molecules and other techniques or vaccines that are similar in structure have been used in some ways. Maybe not in quite the same amount of people, but they have been studied, and so it's not like it just came out of nowhere.
But I don't think it was studied on as
well. That's what I'm saying. Yeah,
giving it to people as a. I don't even want to call it a vaccine. It's like it's medical intervention. It's a gene technology.
All I'm
gene
pushing back is
therapy.
that it's not a total unknown that we just started shoving into people. There is quite a bit of knowledge around it, even though the exact mechanisms haven't been studied at this scale longitudinally.
Isn't that why
Sure.
the US government was funding gain-of-function research? To do research into COVID type of viruses, right? Just in case there's a leakage
How would that
sometime
happen?
in the future,
Yeah.
we know how to fight it.
So there's two aspects there. That yes, there's the actual fact of the U.S. funding gain-of-function research in a lab in Wuhan, China, and whether or not that's a good use of funds. I mean, I guess opinions will vary. Some amount of funding to develop that in order to treat it, in order to understand how it works, I think is generally a good thing to have that on our technological radar. Obviously, perhaps things went awry in the course of that particular research, but that brings up a giant point about this whole COVID thing, and I think Emanuel and I will probably agree on this. The underlying information that we knew or didn't know at a certain time was very improperly communicated to the general public. This idea of the lab leak theory, right? And the
Being
way
very generous there.
well,
Is
I'm
it still a
sorry.
theory? or-
Well, it depends. It depends on who. I think. I mean,
Yeah.
gravity's theory, right? Take your pick. But the way in which information was presented to the public as you can't discuss that even as a possibility, I think was really detrimental to public trust of institutions, and so. There's this idea that, hey, we don't really know the source of this virus. Maybe it formed in nature, and then maybe it was in one of these wet markets in China or something like that. But maybe it was a result of some theory, or from some leak from a lab. And the clearly important open discussion for where the origin of this virus is was dramatically shifted by the way that people are allowed to communicate ideas. And
The discussion was shut down.
exactly,
completely.
yeah. And I don't really understand the motive of that, to be honest. Like, I don't know who benefits by having that particular theory shut down.
The US government. It would be an embarrassment to fund gain-of-function research that then resulted in this virus. It would be a failure on the side of the US government.
But there's a risk associated with shutting that discussion, such as, for example, later evidence that comes out as we're finding.
Well, they knew. I think they knew from the beginning.
Yeah,
They
but-
were just trying to hide evidence that would prove this.
Yeah, that's certainly plausible. I also think that one element of it is that it clearly escalates tensions with China. And so if there's anything that can sort of escalate those tensions, then we might want to tamp it down for foreign policy reasons, because then that just increases the likelihood of some sort of open conflict or something. So that, I guess, to some degree makes sense. But in terms of people just talking on Twitter about where this thing came from, it seems like a big negative to try to shut that down, because you only gain credibility to these quote-unquote conspiracy theories, which I think is a big problem with the way that ideas are discussed in general.
Yes, and just to add to this, so this is from NPR article. Sometimes they get stuff right. This is from which government agencies assess the origin of COVID, how, and it states, quote, 4 of 8 intelligence agencies lean towards a natural origin for the virus with low confidence, while 2 of them, the DOE and the FBI, support a lab origin, with the latter having moderate confidence about its conclusion. And I actually found a tweet from the FBI director.
So you know it's true.
Yeah, from the FBI director, February 28th this year, saying the FBI has for quite some time now assessed the origins of the pandemic. Are most likely a potential lab incident in Wuhan. So they're slowly moving that direction.
Yep.
Which, how trustworthy this is a whole discussion in it of itself.
Right.
'Cause we're almost living in a time where you have to assume that public communication is a form of propaganda and steering conversations in a certain direction.
Well, what I find interesting is that, rewind 2 years, and then, like you said, we weren't allowed to discuss the idea that it was something that came from a lab. So the gospel truth was that it came from natural sources and then propagated from China and then to the rest of the world. Fine. But as time went on, obviously we're having a much more nuanced discussion about who thinks what evidence to suggest that, and I don't understand why that discussion couldn't have happened earlier. And clearly, understanding the truth requires that discussion. You've got people with different motivations, different concerns, different, I don't want to be embarrassed in this way, I don't want to be embarrassed in that way. And unless you have that competing discussion, you're never really going to figure it out. Another example of this is that recent study that came out about the face masks, right? Mm-hmm. So early COVID, once again, dealing with that panic. Government saying we got to do something, and so it makes it look like we're doing something, which is a problem in and of itself. But one way in which they did that is said, okay, let's have everyone wear a face mask. Well, where's the evidence that does anything? It didn't exist. Those studies didn't exist, and the ones that did were with very small sample sizes in uncomparable populations.
In fact, it was the opinion of many public health officials many years prior that you should not do that.
Right.
That was the agreed upon opinion for a long time.
Yep.
That it has the opposite effect.
That this is a useless intervention.
It's not a negative effect. It's not like it's going to transmit more COVID.
You're breathing CO2, right? Like
you're
breathing whatever you're exhaling. So I guess it's not very good.
There is some. I've seen some discussion and evidence around like the actual N95 respirators, especially in children, that it has some negative effect on, for example, your oral health, because you're breathing through your mouth a lot more than through your nose, and that can cause cavities to progress faster. But we're like,
to be honest, that's smaller, pretty, right?
Yeah. But also, I mean, especially around children, you could also make the argument it has a negative effect on communication, development of reading social cues and social intelligence and so on. So there's a lot of like secondary, tertiary effects. But they are more long-term, right? You could make the argument, if we know this works and we need to, in the short term, do something. I understand that, but that evidence wasn't there either, as you were saying.
Right. I'm not going to say that there's negative consequences to wearing face masks. I think it's general. That's pretty benign. Maybe there's going to be something, but it affects us all.
Pissed off about it.
Yeah. Well, yeah, but that just kind of makes me happy, I guess. But what I find interesting is I read this article in CNN the other day, and it was actually a pretty good discussion and breakdown of different studies that looked at different face masks and what they said and what they said.
CNN.
Yeah, I know. I watch CNN sometimes, but I liked it because it basically was taking apart this Cochrane study to try to figure out what the underlying assumptions were, and I thought it was great because it was a nuanced discussion of a controversial topic on CNN, which you never see. And admittedly, it was an opinion piece, so take that with a grain of salt. But what I don't understand is how come that discussion couldn't have happened 2 years ago? And we don't give these important topics that nuanced treatment from the beginning. Maybe it's because of panic, or maybe it's because of just people's tendency to form these sort of coalitions, and then you're not allowed to disagree with those coalitions, particularly in times of crisis. But I really wish that happened in more aspects of discussion for a wide range of topics. Why can't we have that nuance where people bring different evidence to the table? And it's only after the powers that be behind CNN got caught with this really comprehensive study that face masks don't really do a lot, that they're allowed to have this discussion in the hopes that they're motivated to push back on the conclusions from that study.
Yeah, what you're describing is very accurate. I think it comes from the stream of thinking that the emergency is large enough, and we are now going to tailor the flow of information to drive action, right? And it's not about, let's discuss actually things in the most open way possible, find the best solutions, and have rational arguments about it. No, it's about, we know what to do, and we're going to now control information and control like as much as we can to drive a certain collective action of the population. And that's exactly what they tried to do.
Right.
And that's why they drove a fear and panic campaign and tried to institute all these mandates and so on and suppress alternative treatments, right? We can go into all these weird things that were happening. Like there's a scientist and Dr. Peter McCullough that I think a lot of people might know, who did a lot of work on finding alternative treatments and speaking out against the vaccine as a possible way forward. And a lot of that, likewise to the discussion around masks, was suppressed. You could not discuss whether ivermectin is a possible treatment or not. And in fact, it was even smeared, even though, and this is the best example, ivermectin is a drug that's been on the market for decades, that's been given to millions and millions of people, where it has a very low risk and well-known safety profile, where the inventor was given the Nobel Prize for inventing the drug.
I think Emanuel's pro-horse dewormer is what I'm
Yeah, thank you. Yes. And what Aaron just brought up is this and that is one of the most ludicrous and extreme examples where CNN was smearing Joe Rogan as taking horse dewormer, referring to ivermectin, as if he would take a drug that's given to horses. What is the truth? Yes, this drug is given mainly to humans and also sometimes to horses, as is the case with many medications. And then they even went so far, right? Joe Rogan talks about this a lot, to take a video of his and put a weird filter on top so he looks sicker than when they replayed it on television.
That's ridiculous.
And my God, like what was happening, right?
Yeah, I mean, Joe Rogan's got his problems, but he's pretty transparent with a lot of what he does. Yeah,
exactly. And so they were just afraid, like, oh my God, he has a big platform. Yeah. He's gonna influence a lot of people's decisions and actions. No, we need to push against that because we want people to do a certain thing. We don't want people to think. You are not supposed to fucking think. We are supposed to do what we tell you, right? And you can see this on so many levels. Like there was, I forget what the term for this conference was, but there was a conference in late 2019 where a bunch of governmental actors and private industry actors and philanthropists came together and rehearsed what to do in a pandemic. Right? Yeah. It's like you can still look this up on Johns Hopkins University has a homepage dedicated to this conference.
It's almost like they knew.
And well, I don't want to go that far.
Is
right?
this an annual conference? I don't want to. Or was it a one-off?
Or was it like, hey guys, we hear there's something coming down the pipeline?
I don't want to go that far, right? Yeah, but the point I want to make is that people have for a long time thought about what to do in these different scenarios and have come to a certain conclusion of we need to drive public action, and here's the tools that we're going to use to do that, and propaganda and information control is one of their main tools, and that's exactly then what happened. Yeah. Right? They had a toolkit, they found their emergency, boom, they right? If you have the hammer, you hit the nail, right? So, or if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail.
What's
right?
that?
So, yeah. You get my point.
Yeah.
Anyways.
So I actually hope that something that comes out of this, and I don't know how widespread a lot of this pushback is going to be, whether it's in regards to the way the discussion around masks was centered, or around the vaccines, or government response to the pandemic. But you go back to the Constitution, right? And there's this idea that all those old guys had that once you take an individual and you put them in a position of government power, they're still going to be an individual. They're still going to be ambitious. They're still going to go out looking for their self-interests, even if they represent an agency or an institution.
Except George Washington.
He was an exception, and he also never lied. I don't know if you knew that.
There's a few exceptions.
Yeah, neither did Abraham Lincoln. He never lied either. Anyways, and so that's part of the reason that the government was set up, in order to say, hey, the Supreme Court is going to be ambitious and try to increase its own power. The executive branch is going to be ambitious and try to increase its own power, and the Congress is going to be ambitious and try to increase its own power. So you have to set them all against each other, so that none of them ever has too much power, and eventually there's that discussion where, because of the competing interests of the people involved, the truth kind of wins out. And so that was the general idea, right? But there's been a trend basically from the founding, but really picking up during the New Deal and FDR, where you have a crisis. Like, it could be a great crisis, Great Depression, obviously still a horrible time. But there were several institutions that were set up largely as an offshoot of the executive branch during the Great Depression to solve that crisis. The Great Depression is no longer occurring, but
what about the institutions?
90% of those institutions still exist. And so what's happened and continued to happen since then, another big step up, was the invention of the nuclear warhead. Because once you get a nuclear bomb, you don't have time to go to Congress to deliberate whether there should be a declaration of war when there's a nuclear bomb in the sky going towards you. So that dramatically shifted a lot of military power towards the commander-in-chief because of the invention of the nuclear bomb. Because then you gotta act quickly. Mm-hmm. And so you have to give all that power to one person or one branch. So I would say the institutions that were set up during the Great Depression to sort of put a lot of power in the executive branch, followed by the creation of the atomic weapon, really has created an imbalance of power in the constitutional setup the way it should be. So how does that manifest itself today? I don't know if you guys remember this, but I hated this when it happened. When the CDC, which is technically part of the executive branch, came out and said, if you are a renter and you don't have money to pay your rent because you got kicked out of your job because of COVID-related whatever, then you don't have to pay your rent. And I have no idea where in the Constitution it says that the CDC, which isn't an entity that's described in the Constitution, has that particular power. And no one cared. It seemed like no one was concerned about the fact that...
Not even the landlords?
Well, the landlords, but they're rich property owners. They don't really have an opinion. They're not the little guy.
So the government was not subsidizing it. It was just never paid.
It was just the landlords have to just suck it up.
Oh.
Because they're the rich.
And that was in place for a long time.
It
right?
was.
Yeah.
And I remember reading that, and I'm just going, how come no one's talking about this?
Yeah.
And it's like, where in the charter of the CDC it says it has the power to do that? Oh, well, it's a big emergency.
Yeah.
And now that sort of line has been crossed, there's going to be a lot less resistance from the CDC doing something similarly for, influenza, whatever it is. It could be a much less severe crisis, so to speak. And so this idea that when you have a crisis, you have to create institutions to solve that short-term crisis, we really have to be careful to not create something that's going to outlive the crisis itself. And once that problem has been solved, whether that institution contributed to the solution or not, right, then that particular institution should be dissolved for until the next crisis, I guess. And so that's a big concern that's been going on since FDR, really, but it seemed to accelerate in recent years. Of course.
So where does that lead to?
Well,
if you think this through in the long term.
Are you familiar with the Roman Republic?
Vaguely, I wasn't there at the time.
Well,
Where does this lead to? The Roman Republic.
You're a little older than me, but
thank you.
so
it's the vegan diet keeping me looking
right,
back.
Right, that's it.
Really
can't
thousands
forget.
of years old.
Yeah. So one of the things that happened in the Roman Empire or Roman Republic is that basically, and this is like, I'm not a Roman historian by any sense, but it shifted from a republic type government to a dictatorial type.
44 BC was when Caesar was assassinated.
That was when he was assassinated.
But it took until 28 BC when Octavian actually took reign. So there was a period of whatever.
Yeah, but
16 years.
But that was just the beginning of the dictatorship.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And so what I'm saying is that a system that started off as a republic, because of these incremental changes towards more tyrannical government, eventually basically just says, all right, emperor, you're control of everything. Have at it. And that's what happened with Julius Caesar, followed by Octavian, followed by another, 500 years of Roman Empire, as opposed to a Roman Republic. So you say, where does it end? And I think we see it. I think it's why presidential elections are so much more important than the midterm elections for most Americans, right? Because you have the president who's in control of the executive branch, and it's so much easier for the president to make policy than it is for Congress. Because Congress, you actually have to compromise, and you have to debate, and you have to create these Frankenstein bills that don't really make anyone happy and kind of halfway solve some problems, where it's just so much easier if the executive branch waves his hand with an executive order. And then solves the problem immediately. Yeah. Right? And so I think that's the trend. And so we're seeing Congress have less and less power as time goes on, and the executive branch, particularly the president, is able to execute policy much more rapidly. And that shouldn't happen, right? You shouldn't have the president saying, Congress, I want this bill. The bill should come from Congress. I don't know. So that's the trend that I see.
I would like to point out one executive order in particular, relating back to what we just talked about.
Still not over.
To this day, it is now March 11, 2023. The United States government still requires non-citizens and non-green card holders to be vaccinated to enter the country.
And that's why Novak Djokovic couldn't play in the US Open.
Correct.
Or
And
any
my
other
parents
match.
can't come visit and see my newborn daughter. So,
yep, there you go. But that's an executive order, not an act of Congress.
Yes,
Yeah.
and it doesn't even have an expiration date, by the way.
I believe it. Most of them don't,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so I think what we see now, and why it seems like politics is like a tennis match, right? You get Obama, then you get Trump, then you get Biden, and no one's really able to form a coherent, consistent policy that lasts longer than their 4 to 8 years. And that's because all of the power is centered in the executive branch. And so you have all this inertia going one way, and then you get all the inertia going the other way when you get the next guy in office, and then it goes all the way back. And so it seems like there's no coherent policy. But you also get this inertia towards increasing executive power, and that typically doesn't go backwards. So
can I ask you a question to that?
Yes.
Thinking this through, also again along the same lines. So where does that lead to? One thing that I think about, and one thing that I follow is technological development around AI, right? And you could make the argument that as that development is speeding up, as the individual member of society has access to technologies that are so powerful and thereby, have huge potential for benefit, but also huge risk, and pose a real safety issue for society at large, doesn't that necessitate someone in control shutting things down? Someone with dictatorial powers being able to act quickly and controlling these technologies and the access to them?
That's a good question that I don't think we really know the answer to, but I think we're going to have to figure it out in the next few decades.
Yeah.
So I think that's the easy answer, right? Is putting someone in control in order to sort of control this discussion or the transmission of this particular technology. But we have to be extremely careful who we put in control and what checks are on them.
Yeah.
Right. It's generally considered that the best form of government is an all-knowing, benevolent dictator. But you can't. First of all, they don't exist. But that might be one person who's all-knowing and all-benevolent. But what about the successor? What about the successor after that?
Right.
And so even if you pick the best guy for the job to solve that particular problem, who's going to take the job after them? Probably not going to be as good. And clearly attracts the kind of person who's just attracted to power, which is not typically who you want in control.
Right.
So that might be a short-term solution. I think that's the easiest solution, and I think that's the solution people are going to be clamoring with. But I think the best solution, and this is very implausible, is kind of like a Thomas Jefferson idea who believed in the idea of the educated, independent citizen. So there's this idea that America is founded based on the knowledge and works of the individual. That's why we're allowed to vote. That's why we have a voice in American politics. And you have to have a citizenry that is sufficiently well educated, not necessarily book smart, but sufficiently well educated about their own biases and about the biases of others and about the course of history, and able to make good decisions based on the information that's presented to them.
Yeah.
And I think we're going to have a real challenge with that as we sort of encounter some of these AI technologies, because we're going to have a citizenship that is able to withstand the
deep fakes.
Exactly. And that includes, for example, we've mentioned this before when we were discussing the podcast earlier, but there's a professor who I really like called Jonathan Haidt, who talks about bias and the way that people think about politics and controversial issues. And he has this analogy that the way we think about issues is that something happens and then our intuition or our gut response points us in a certain direction. And it's like an elephant. So our elephant charges off in a certain direction, and then our brain and our consciousness is the little guy on top of the elephant trying to control which way he goes. So I think what's going to happen with AI and other, any topic really, is that we're going to be presented with information, and all of our individual elephants are going to be running off in certain directions and, following the coalition or the group that we're a part of. But we need to be able to recognize that, hey, this may not be what I really want it to be in terms of my intuition. And I think if citizens aren't aware of their own biases and they aren't willing to challenge them and recognize that those biases are exactly what's being targeted, then I think we're going to have a big problem.
Yeah.
How do you think we should regulate AI?
First of all, I'm not even sure if we should. Right, and then how we should is another big question.
Yeah.
I don't think we know enough about AI, and then any sort of regulation that happens, AI is already going to be advanced past the point where that regulation is effective or meaningful in any way, just based on the way it goes. What I'm actually most concerned about is the, you think about something like attention span, and how human attention span has been dramatically reduced. You can blame iPhones, you can blame YouTube, whatever it is. And that's just a relatively small part of our day-to-day functioning. What about our ability to form sentences? You get something like ChatGPT and you say, I don't even have to think. I just put a couple of buzzwords and it creates my thought for me. That I find really, really scary, because then we're going to get a whole population that doesn't ever need to learn how to think. Like, wow. That I find very scary.
I understand these concerns, but I like to have a little bit more optimistic view on that, such that it becomes a helpful tool to society, just like phones or computers with the access to all of information that humankind gathered over time, right? We have now access to that at any point in time, and it has its downsides, but it's becoming just a useful tool for us to use. And if you're careful, you can still develop a lot of these traits. And in fact, have time to develop other things, right? Because you don't need to do certain manual labor things.
Yeah. So you're right in the sense that it can be a useful tool. But let me give a
Yes.
counterexample that I think will hit home. So let's say you go to ChatGPT and you say, I want to do a literature search of all literature related to the COVID vaccine, and I want to really understand its negative outcomes. So you say, hey, ChatGPT or Being AI or whatever it is, give me all data that sort of shows some of the negative effects of COVID. And then it says, there are no negative effects.
Yeah.
Why not, right? Why wouldn't it say that? We already get that with, other entities such as YouTube or Google or whatever. And so who's to say that that particular tool isn't shifted in one way or another?
So that tool being weaponized.
Not
right?
weaponized, I think, is too strong, but
Yes.
biased. And we got to be careful with the word bias because the people creating the bias are sure that they're right.
But now you're making an argument for not regulating too strongly.
Correct.
Right? And
which is not the same as not regulating at all.
Sure.
Yeah.
And what's going to happen, as far as I understand this technology, is there's obviously OpenAI that has made a lot of progress and have put out their product as ChatGPT, but there's a lot of alternative new models that do very similar things that are open source that other groups are working on. And so there's going to be sufficient competition in the market that at some point this is going to be commoditized, and you're going to have access to a lot of different ones of those large language models. And so just one company then putting a bias filter in front of it is not going to have the stronghold on society.
So I would agree with you, except for the fact that what about news organizations, right, that used to present data, used to present the news. Yet what do we have now? We have Fox News and we've got CNN. So what I'm worried about that particular approach is that if you've got the ChatGPT that caters to certain ideas over others, or let's just say caters to all ideas, however you want to define it, but then you have one system that is maybe a little more biased. And it's not like all of them have to be biased, but you could still create that clear split, right? Look about what happened with Twitter when Elon Musk took over. If you were a fan of freedom of speech, then you were kind of like, oh, this is great. This guy seems like he really cares about freedom of speech. But if you were a fan of the old Twitter, then you're like, no, this is going to be an anarchic jungle that is, full of all these right-wing nut jobs. And so you wouldn't want that. So you'd create your own little system, right, where you can have your nice discussions. And so even if most of the artificial intelligence portal systems, whatever you want to call them, are pretty free, pretty open source, you're still going to get that splitting effect, which I think is detrimental to democratic government.
Sure. And actually with Twitter, I saw that a little bit. I was part of science Twitter for a while. I don't know if you follow that little corner of Twitter where a lot of professors are interacting and posting the newspapers and such. And a lot of them, when Elon took over, were making public declarations of leaving the platform.
Sure, yeah.
Oh my God, it's so unsafe, and now we're going to be filled with like racist comments and all kinds of nasty things. I have to leave. I'm just thinking, what in the hell are you talking about?
Yeah,
right.
And whether or not they left, like, I mean, it's
right,
still,
and most of them actually didn't.
Of course, yeah.
But
But you know why they were saying that? Because Elon let back in the right-wing professors who were proving the other professors wrong, right?
Right.
And they didn't want to be proven wrong publicly. So they were like, I would rather leave than be proven wrong.
As they should, right? I mean, if they're an intellectual, then their trade is the realm of ideas, then it's a attack on their livelihood.
But what they should do, what their job is as a public intellectual, is to present their best researched viewpoint that they have come to after a lot of work and research, and then be subjected to criticism by either their peers or public at large, and then being able to defend whatever their findings were based on the best data. And if the data doesn't support, then change it. That's what I think the job of a public intellectual or a professor or a researcher.
So you have to distinguish between the intellectual as a human and the intellectual as a process. So I don't know if you know Thomas Sowell, but he's this really great conservative intellectual. If you could get him on the podcast, that'd be fantastic. But he's a hard guy to find. So he talks a lot about the difference between intellectuals as people and intellectuals as a process. And one of the things he says is that once you give someone the title of intellectual, it's not like they lose all of their ambition and self-interestedness.
Right.
So if you have two choices, you're a public intellectual, right? And let's say we're going to go out and have a fight in the realm of ideas, and may the best idea win. That's how it should work. But you also have the choice to pull on some lever of power in some closed door to basically shut down that idea and completely remove the risk of a threat to your livelihood, really. Mm-hmm. Some people would choose the former, but I think the incentive structure is such to where a lot of people would choose the latter, right? And you'd be able to not only prevent discussion and increase your own influence, but you wouldn't have any threats. So, most people as like a class would choose that second option, which is obviously not how it should work, but often how it does work, just because of the way humans work.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that.
Yeah.
Do public intellectuals ever change their mind? Can you give me an example of a public intellectual that has publicly changed their mind?
Changed their mind, or even admitted that they were wrong.
Yeah, admitted that they were wrong. Exactly.
I'm sure there are.
Are there?
Yeah, like you're putting us on the spot. I have seen this goes in that direction. I have seen Jordan Peterson in discussions in public, or certain podcasts where the other person will correct him and he'll stand corrected and take in the new information. So it's not really changing his mind, but he's at least open to new information.
But there's a difference between like a sort of nuanced point where they're like, oh yeah, you're right. I said 70% when really it's 60% or some statistic. Between that and then some sort of core ideological belief. So having a public intellectual sort of shift their mind on a core ideological belief is quite rare. It does happen, but it's pretty rare. I'm trying to think of an example where that would be the case.
I actually have an example.
Yep,
I think Naomi Wolf. Are you familiar? She's a female intellectual, and she recently published a Substack article that I haven't read. I just saw the headline, which says, "I am sorry, I was wrong about January 6th." Right. So with the recent evidence, which showed that January 6th was not as violent as people thought, and that a lot of the videotapes were censored, and they showed the main guy, Anon Shaman, whatever his name was, the guy with the horns. Yeah. He was walking around peacefully, and he was being escorted by the police around the Capitol. Yeah. He was being given access to like Nancy Pelosi's office and the floor. He thanked the police for escorting him. He was just a very nice, peaceful guy, right? And he was sentenced to prison. I think 4 years. He got 4 years, whatever. Yeah. So a lot of people were misinformed, again, by the government and the mainstream media about the events of January 6th. And now it was like, I'm sorry, I thought this was a violent event. I was blaming these protesters, and it turned out I was wrong.
Well, I would say that the main conclusion is still true. It was clearly like a disgusting attack on the institutions of power and everything. And I think it's just kind of an addendum. And I really think that the mainstream media and the government made a big mistake by trying to hide that footage from the general public.
Yeah.
First of all, the whole discussion about, we have this whole January 6th committee, and most of the people on that committee didn't even watch all the footage. And then you have this funny game with Kevin McCarthy, who selectively gives the full footage to Tucker Carlson, which that is just a silly. Why didn't Kevin McCarthy put it on YouTube? Or put it on his own private, video channel or whatever on his website? Because that seems like information that people would want to see. And why does it have to be filtered through these sort of handlers in order to come to the right conclusion? But I think the main thrust of the conclusion of the mainstream media and the government is still true in regards to January 6th. It's just that they were trying to make a certain point, and the more violent and scary it was, the more it benefited the cause that they were advocating for. But I don't think that they really lose much by being completely transparent. And in fact, they can claim full transparency. And so now there's going to be a big backlash. And a lot of people are going to think that, it was actually a very peaceful event and it's really kind of a nothing, event. And I don't think that's true. I think it was a really bad, big, important day.
Why?
Why is that a really bad?
Why was it so bad and so important?
Well,
that's what I don't understand.
So I think it's mostly symbolic. Right, the edge between a energetic rally and a semi-violent riot, right, is kind of a fine line, right? Mm-hmm. And so you had a group of people who were there on January 6th, and of course I'm generalizing, who felt like they were advocating for a candidate who they believed really and truly won the election, or maybe deep down they were advocating for some sort of political cause that they felt like is more important than the one that was going to be taking over with the Biden administration. So the fact that there's this deep-seated resentment that spilled over from energetic rally into semi-violent rioting in such a public way, I think is a symptom of a greater disease, right? And so it just became much more obvious or much more noticeable And so just having that data point that says, hey, we've got this simmering rage that exists in certain portions of the population. And I don't think it's that Trump incited it. I think he sort of rode the wave. He might have been the figurehead, but he didn't create that.
True.
And so the fact that we have this imagery of those people with that resentment sort of boiling over and crossing a line that formerly they wouldn't cross, or for most presidencies they don't cross, I think is really indicative of a sentiment in public opinion that most people weren't aware of, right? And so rather than saying, oh, let's dismiss it as they're right-wing nuts, or they're just anarchists, or they're what, like there's actually a real sentiment there, and it's a strong enough sentiment to try to actually break into the Capitol building, and that's a big red flag for the way public discourse is had. On the other side, right? So flip things around, right? What if it was a mob of socialists who charged in there and tried to threaten to hang Mitch McConnell or whatever? I think then the discussion would be similarly like, whoa, what's going on here? There's clearly some resentment that exists in a certain group of population, and the fact that they crossed that line is really indicative of the intensity.
So, but yes, I understand all the points you're making, right? And I agree somewhat, but what I don't understand is the importance we're placing on the singular event, because what you're describing is true and had come out in many, 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 many other events prior, right?
So it came out, but was it visible?
Yeah.
By who?
What do you mean, was it visible?
Was it visible by people who watch CNN?
No. Right?
Exactly.
So we're in that way you're describing just the powers that be, if you will, selectively picking events to feed a certain narrative, right? But this rage where people are passionate about a certain topic, and then a small percentage of that turn violent, had happened in the years prior around the entire George Floyd
BLM
and BLM.
There were statistics that actually show BLM killed more people, I think 47.
Oh, I'm sure that's true.
Than the January 6th protests that the Democrats were trying to hide.
And also property damages and all sorts
right?
of
And they were attacking also government buildings all around the country, right? Police.
I think the main difference is symbolism.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. But then, yeah, sure.
I think January 6th was an escalation of events that had been happening before that, right? Like Trump was the reason why January 6th happened. His tweets over the past, 4 months before led to this event.
I also disagree with that. I think he incited it to some degree, and he sort of encouraged it. But
he was the person who said the election was a fraud. Which was why the event happened.
He was the one who could stop it most easily, but I wouldn't say that he was the one that caused it.
What caused it then?
Deep-seated resentments in a subset of the population that maybe were encouraged by Donald Trump, but weren't caused by him.
So you're saying if he wasn't saying that the election was a fraud, this would have happened?
Maybe not that day, but those sentiments would have still exist and would continue to grow over time.
Yeah, a division in the population that had been growing over a much longer time than even Donald Trump was on the political scene, and that both sides profited from, the news media profited from, right? Obama made use of that in his second term a lot, where he talked about race a lot and kind of in a way dividing the country instead of bringing it together. And Donald Trump was kind of like the one who just opened the valve on the big pressure that was built up in society. I don't think he's responsible for this day.
I think he's responsible for it happening on that day. Right.
Yeah.
But the root causes is not something that that was his fault. It's something that he benefited from, though.
What I also don't understand is like, why are we letting this happen in the first place? Why are we letting BLM riots happen? Why are we letting homeless people in Austin set shit on fire and leave trash everywhere? Why are we letting people break in the Capitol building of the United States, which I thought was probably the most secure place in this country, if not on Earth?
So I've got an answer to this. If you're done.
We could just prevent this. It's just a matter of willingness to do it.
Right. So the way the Constitution works is right. Congress makes the laws. Executive branch executes the laws.
Sure.
Part of the benefit of being the executive branch is that you get to choose which laws to execute. And I think that's a horrible way of governing, but that's unfortunately the way it works, right? Basically, you can say, I find this law unfavorable for whatever reason, and therefore I'm not going to choose to follow it. You see that, for example, on the border, right? There are clear laws defining the way that the border should be structured and who's allowed to cross and who's not allowed to cross. And then you've kind of got the implementation of those laws, right, which depends on who the president is.
Right. And
that's absolutely not the way that it should work. But if you've got a person in office, and it doesn't necessarily have to be the executive branch of the federal government, it could go down to the state level too. But if you basically say there are certain laws that I disagree with, and so rather than do my duty, I can just choose not to follow them, there's going to be half of the population that reelects you.
Well, the police is supposed to enforce the laws, and it
correct.
didn't at that point.
Who funds the police?
Who funds the police?
Yeah,
the government.
Who makes the laws that sort of allocate funds to the police?
The Congress.
Right. So government can make the decision if they want to weaken the police or strengthen the police based on laws that aren't necessarily in the books. They can choose to enforce this law over the other. And so I think that has that trickle-down effect. Or even if the police, the individual, are doing their job, they may or may not be given the resources or the assignments in order to actually have that policy be executed, which is really unfortunate. And it basically allows this practical government to exist divorced from the legal government in ways that the public has no idea, because government's so big and so complicated, and it's really easy to hide. And then they all have got, like we talked about earlier, their individual elephants that charges off and makes their own assumptions if it agrees or disagrees with how they think the world should work.
Yeah. I want to comment on one aspect that I think is really important, what's happening in a lot of American cities right now around policing, and how we have to also remember that police officers, right, men and women of the police, are just human beings who make their own choices, how enthusiastically to perform the job. And a lot of the sentiment in blue cities in the US, Austin included, was against police. The whole narrative around defunding police, actually taking funds away for a little bit, then refunding them. But overall, the sentiment tends to be in their opposition instead of supporting police as a necessary part to keep civil peace. And so, if I would be a police officer, I would look for my way out. Or if you can't leave the position, then you're just going to do the minimum you need to, and you have to. Why would you go out of your way now to tackle society's most difficult problems if you're not even being appreciated for it? Right?
Not just appreciated, but you're not given the tools to really even make a dent on those problems.
Sure.
In a lot of ways. So I have something to say about that. But
okay. No. So right before we took a break and I took my jacket off, it's getting warm in here, because of the topics and the room temperature. It's heating up. Now, what we talked about, the last point I was trying to throw out there is that police officers are just human beings, and if there's like this demoralization in a public sentiment that tends to be against the position that they're holding, they're going to do only the minimum, and those are the results that we're seeing right now in the communities.
So there's a spectrum that I like to talk about when it comes to politics. So right now, when you talk politics, it's like, okay, are you a Republican, are you Democrat? And that's frequently the axis upon which that discussion takes place. But I like to think about it in a slightly different perspective, and that all kind of began way back when with the founding of political parties, with Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson, and the first sort of political conflict in the United States. And I like it because it has very little bearing on how politics is discussed today. And so you can find elements from everyone that you talk to that like, oh yeah, that's bad or that's good. And it's a lot easier to sort of get through those walls that people put up where if you say, oh, I'm a Republican, then they clearly label you as something, and then you can't have a discussion. So Hamilton was really afraid of the mob and anarchy. And so he was a big fan of a strong government to sort of push back on the anarchy that exists in societies all over the world, right? And Thomas Jefferson was really afraid of tyranny. And so he disliked, for example, England, which had this top-down government and constricted the freedoms of the citizens. And so I think that spectrum of anarchy to tyranny comes out today in a lot of interesting ways. So you brought up a good example for the policemen. So the discussion around how much tyrannical power should policemen have in order to police neighborhoods and do their jobs versus the role of the policeman in general, which is to prevent anarchy, right? And so it's
just say, why do you call it tyrannical power that they have?
So policemen can arrest you.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
That clearly takes away your rights.
Sure.
And to some degree,
Yeah.
with a probable cause, right?
Yeah.
And so if you expand that to larger scale, then that's clearly a tyrannical action. So loss of freedoms and for whether probable cause or not.
Sure.
But there also exists in order to sort of push back on any sort of chaotic event or chaotic society, whatever that is, whether that individuals causes people's, something like that. And so I think what we see with the discussion around police is that we've kind of forgotten as a country that the police are there to solve one problem and are only focused on their slight encroachment into tyrannical behavior, right? And so a lot of this discussion against police has to do with the fact that they're individuals, they maybe make mistakes sometimes, they very likely could be biased, and they could arrest people who look a certain way more so than they arrest people who look in a different way. And so as a result, their ability to commit tyrannical acts is not always impartial because they're individuals. But in general, on a historical scale, they do a pretty good job of what they're supposed to be doing.
Yeah.
But let's say you defund them because those tyrannical acts become unpalatable to the general public. Then you're stuck with the other end of the spectrum, in which case you are reminded of the anarchy that exists underneath the presence of police, right?
Yeah.
And so that's why you see in communities where police were removed, it's become much less livable, and you get a lot more shoplifting, you get a lot more petty crime, and a lot more violent crime. And we've seen that just in
a
the
lot
last...
more gun crime.
Yes, and
Yeah.
we've seen that just in the last 2 years. And so I like that as sort of a microcosm of the spectrum between anarchy and tyranny that I think is a really good way to approach political topics, because you've got both Republicans and Democrats who don't like extremes of either, right? Look at Republicans who talk about the tyrannical behavior of big tech or whatever, right? They take away their freedom to learn information. But then you also have Democrats who are afraid of the tyrannical power of the police. And so in some sense, we're trying to find this balance between these two spectrums, but depending on the field that we're interested in, we kind of take one side or the other. Mm-hmm. And so I like that framing of political discussions because I find it a lot easier to agree and to find sort of common ground between people.
Yeah, I love this framework. It's really good, and it's tricky to find the balance there, right? Because like you said, most people don't like extremes on either end. Mm-hmm. I would agree with that. And in many ways, I do enjoy some of the more, let's say, anarchy-like elements of the U.S. because mm-hmm. it gives me more freedom to do certain things in my life. But I absolutely do not enjoy some of the consequences of that, like mm-hmm. the topic of homelessness that we just brought up. So, yeah, I don't have a good solution to that either. But
what do you think is the solution, Aaron?
Solution in what way?
To the rising negative sentiment towards the police, right? And the defund the police movement.
Yeah, I mean, I think to some degree it's kind of already solved itself. Because it's very funny. It took like 18 months for people to say, oh, police are terrible, we got to completely defund them. And then just in a couple of places, you see these huge spikes in violent crime. And then it's like, oh, yeah, they're there for a reason. Yeah. And so I think, fortunately, and even though that's kind of been, maybe pushed to the side in the public discourse, people kind of know that, oh, yeah, that's right, it's important to have them. And so, thankfully, that information is available enough in order to be able to sort of recalibrate mm-hmm. based on, we bumped up against one bumper, which was difficult for some people to stomach. And so we said, well, let's take away some of those tyrannical powers. And then we ran into too much anarchy. So we got to move back a little bit.
What frustrates me a lot about, and this is not only specific to this topic, but with any problem of society, we tend to go very extreme into highlighting that problem and purposefully ignoring any nuance of the topic that might be perceived as weakening the argument or weakening the focus on the actual problem. And this policing thing mm-hmm. is a perfect example because while maybe there's a small percentage of police that acted in tyrannical ways and even in racially biased ways that should not have been happening, the usually statistics don't support that. And that was never part of the discussion. Like, you're not even allowed to discuss reality, right? And I would like to come to a future in which we teach young people or the society at large that issues are generally complicated, and while there is a problem, there is nuances to that problem, and some of these nuances might not support the initial problem, like January 6th, where there's riots and there's also peacefully walking to the building and there's the police acting weirdly, not arresting the person, and like all of this is true at the same time. And then you're left to think, like, what am I supposed to believe now? well, there is no arching narrative here. There's all of these things that happen to be true, and then we need to just puzzle it together and see which of those do we need to change or solve.
Yeah.
What conclusions do we need to draw? But let's have honest discussions about all of these things. And just the video of January 6th coming out, the peaceful part of it, doesn't mean that the violence didn't happen, and that the violence happened doesn't mean that also happened. Both happened.
Right.
Both is true.
Right. So I would say that the reason why that doesn't happen, right, is because of this conflation of what qualifies as a crisis. And we talked about this earlier. But as soon as you define something as a crisis, then the people who are proposing the most extremes to solve that particular crisis get sort of social capital, right? And so in a unifactor analysis, public discourse is all about solving that one particular crisis. And so the more extreme you are, the more likely people are to follow you because you're clearly going after that immediate problem.
Right.
But there's clearly long-term consequences to that, and then this yanking around from crisis to crisis is not a way to actually solve problems and create sustainable solutions in the long run.
Yeah, very much agree.
Agree.
Are we supposed to disagree here?
I still like Texas barbecue.
I want to just say this example of, I know someone who was cancelled because he was trying to discuss BLM.
Rest in peace.
And the George Floyd murder. Yeah, he was fired. He sent this.
Fired. What
he
kind
was
of
fired from
position
his
was
job. He was working for an edtech startup that had close ties with Google. And when the George Floyd murder happened, he wrote this very constructive post on Facebook where he said, look, like he thought that the policeman was just following whatever he was taught, and that this like kneeling on his neck was part of the training that the policemen do, that it was a standard procedure, and it just happened to kill George Floyd. And he got a lot of backlash, it went viral, and then the next day he was fired from his job.
Wow.
So now he's working for a nonprofit, and it's like I am against any ideology or movement that stifles discussion. I think anything should be discussed, right? Because that's how you arrive at the truth.
Sure.
And truth is not the end game. It's something that has to be pursued at all times.
And I think
it's a balance.
I think it's cowardly of big organizations like Google and everything. Because the reason they fired him, or his startup with close ties to Google, the reason they fired him is because they were fear of backlash from the people that pay them.
Yeah.
Right. Who then are fear of backlash from people on Twitter or whatever.
The advertisers.
Right. And so here's that interesting interplay between the anarchy of the mob on Twitter, but also expressing itself in a tyrannical action of a specific company or corporation. So that's also interesting. A similar thing happened with James Damore, right, at Google. And I read the text that he wrote, and it was pretty nuanced and based in statistics. And I don't understand why the conclusion, like at worst, he's wrong.
Can you remind me what exactly he wrote about gender? And
he was discussing gender in terms of why more men tend to be software engineers than women and that sort of thing. And the main point was basically that maybe they're interested in different things.
Yeah.
That was kind of the conclusion, and then got him fired.
And and these things happening, right? That we're stifling discussion with the goal to keep the focus on the problem. Actually, it causes the opposite in many ways, right? With the Black Lives Matter movement, for instance, which I think there is some justification for such a movement to exist, and there's like important things to discuss around race. Me as a white man, right?
Always have to say that.
Yeah. So disregard anything I have to say. I'm not allowed to have an opinion on this. So but keep listening. So, but I honestly think that there is some importance to this, but then stifling any discussion around reality of certain events, and BLM almost becoming a corrupt money laundering scheme, right? Thank you. Doesn't help the cause at all, right? It just undermines it, and it destroys credibility. And now we're just like moving on, and we haven't really solved this in a positive way as it could be solved.
So I think it's interesting. So you've got something like the BLM riots, and then that by extension you've got companies and organizations who want to be positively associated with the sentiment behind it. I'll say that. So there's that issue, but then they also don't want to have negative consequences. And so, like you mentioned, there's been a lot of donations by Coca-Cola and other giant organizations to BLM. And the point of those donations isn't actually to solve the problem of racial prejudice. It's to basically cover their own reputations, right? And so in some sense, you could say that the point is both. But I think the ultimate incentive is that people don't want to be labeled as racially prejudiced or racist or whatever as an organization. And one way to get around that is to donate money to causes such as Black Lives Matter. Right. Then you have to actually look at, okay, they're getting all this money to solve this particular problem. How close are they actually to solving that problem? And the answer is that it's not close at all, right? That money went nowhere.
What annoys me, sorry to cut you off, but what annoys me so much about these issues too, right? Like, we're both scientists.
We're also both white men, just seems relevant.
Thank you, yes. And I think all of us are rational thinkers here, right? And in some sense, pragmatists. At least I would describe myself as such. Like, if I see a problem, I would like to know, how can we actually solve it? And what can we actually do to solve it? And not do some nebulous action that kind of looks good and feels good, but doesn't actually solve the problem, right? And so with racial disparities, let's stick with the topic, right? It is true that if you look at income and how it's distributed, that the black population in the US does worse than other racial groups, right? That is true. Mm-hmm. Is the solution to that to then take people that are in the working population of a certain race and just pay them more or give them positions that they might not be qualified for? No. But is the solution maybe starting with young people and seeing what's going on in the community that is causing a lot of members of that community to not be as successful as other racial groups? What can we do to support these young people? What can we do to improve schooling? What can we do to give them or help them to make use of the opportunities that they do have? What can we do to give them more opportunities? That would actually solve the problem, right? Or at least go in the right direction. But instead, we're having discussions about racial quotas in companies, about equity, whatever that means.
Affirmative action.
Affirmative action and around college admissions, for instance, right? Yeah. That I think just leads into the wrong direction.
You could even back up a little further. Yeah. So let's look at income, for example. If you look at average income between different ethnic groups, what if one ethnic group is just a little older on average? Older people have more money.
Yeah.
Is the white ethnic group older than?
Yeah, I don't have that particular number. Maybe.
Then you can just make the argument. Well, and that's made by people in the social justice space, right? That white people had generational wealth passed down, and black people didn't have that, and therefore we need to now pay them reparations. Which, by the way, I found this out the other day. There's American cities, San Francisco among them, no surprise, who formed committees. Yeah. That are currently studying how to pay reparations to people on the order of millions per person.
Yeah. Fortunately for you, they're going to study that forever, and they're never going to come up with a number, because that's impossible to calculate.
I'm just going to enjoy then the discussion around how much percent black do you have to be in order to receive reparations.
Or what if you could say that your ancestors were Russian serfs?
Yes. Yeah.
How's that play out? But anyways. But even the idea that, hey, maybe the source of this income difference is just because of difference in age, and generally people who are older are wealthier, whether that's because of their grandparents or not, like that doesn't matter. But that multivariable analysis never is allowed to occur. Yeah. And it's just
coming back to the nuance that's missing. Yeah. Right.
And so someone brought up, I think it was you brought up affirmative action, and something that I find really interesting about affirmative action. What's the goal, right? What problem are they trying to solve?
They want to have equal representation. Let's say the population has, I think, 14% black people, right? In the US, they would like to have 14% of the student body mirror the population representation. So they want to admit just as many black people to college.
I actually don't think that's exactly the problem. I think it's more that they recognize that generationally the opportunities have been different. And they're trying to rebalance that. So what they're trying to do is use college as a mechanism to later in life rebalance those differences in opportunities to some degree, right? Sure. So the idea is that you're able to go to a good school, you're going to have more opportunities. So even if you perhaps weren't able to compete with your SAT scores for other people, by going to that university, you're able to do better on in life and help rebalance those inequities. Yeah. does it work? Have we measured it? And how do we measure it?
Yeah.
Because frequently it's measured by pointing to population of African American or Hispanic students in college, and they use that as a proxy for a solution to the later downstream problem. But it's not a good proxy, right? So if you're actually trying to redistribute, I guess, those opportunities, it doesn't even solve the problem it sets out to do. But you can't say that.
No one's doing the research.
Right.
Because no one wants to see the data.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think it's intentional because, at what point would we say, okay, affirmative action, the goal was accomplished and we can, get rid of that program? Do you think that will ever happen?
No.
Why?
It's with so many of these movements, they kind of have to justify their existence.
Correct.
In a way too. And so the goalpost moves.
Because
moves.
they're populated by individuals with ambitions and incentives that are
Sure.
maybe different from the end goal of the supposed project.
Sure. Yeah.
And so there's a strong incentive for people who are working in the affirmative action policy, whatever that involves, to keep it going. And so there's no end goal.
Yeah.
And so that's why it's quite destructive.
And by the way, let's be equal opportunity attackers on this issue, right? Like, if we're talking about affirmative action, I think we should get rid of the racial affirmative action, but we should also get rid of legacy admissions, for instance, to colleges, which kind of is an affirmative action.
Should it be a federal policy, or could it be a private institution making that decision?
Well, many colleges in the U.S. receive federal funding, right? Mm-hmm. You're asking me.
So that wasn't an answer.
But then how do you figure out if the admission was legacy or not?
Yeah.
There's a very fine line between the admission requirements.
Well, like if your dad goes to Princeton.
Well, they canceled SATs and ACTs. So there is no quantitative way to figure out if this person is smart or not, right? So they could look at this person and see, that this person's dad went to this university, accept him based on his qualitative
pedigree.
Yeah, his pedigree, and make it seem like it's not a legacy admission, even though it is.
Well, okay.
I mean, I kind of agree that legacies are a little bit silly, and it's unfair, but also private institutions are allowed to do whatever they'd like in terms of, because they're also alumni tend to give a lot of money, and if you're an alumnus and you give a lot of money, then it's sort of understood that maybe there's going to be a little bit of an agreement there, and that's not necessarily fair.
I get all this, and I would like to have legacy admissions for my children.
Yeah.
But it's still, I recognize that it's, in this discussion, I perceive it as just as unfair as I perceive affirmative action based on racial grounds.
Yeah, I don't disagree.
Yeah. Well, on this point, I also have a friend who was a data analyst at Reuters. And Reuters is a data provider, right, to a lot of financial institutions. And his job was to gather data on BLM.
Oh, boy.
And the effect of BLM on the black community.
Did he get fired?
Right. He did get fired. It was literally his job. And he went to his boss. He presented this data, which showed that, gun crime, violence increased as a result of the protests. And BLM protests actually had a negative impact on the black community. That's what his data showed. It was a fact.
Well, his interpretation of
his
data,
interpretation, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So he sent this data to his boss, and the next day he was fired.
Wow.
He wrote in, it's ridiculous. It was his job. He wasn't trying to input his opinion into this. It was facts. It was data.
Yeah.
And they fired him.
So here's an interesting point. So what's the purpose of a company, right? Generally, companies exist to make profit. There can be sort of side purposes, and you can say create value, because it's South by Southwest, and they like to talk about that. But so a purpose of companies is to create value. But I think what we're seeing is that there's a split between a lot of organizations now, and there's a competing interest of creating value while also still purporting to be proponents of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I don't think both of those are sustainable. You can't do both. You can do both, but you can't say our North Star is to create a profit and also to promote an environment of diversity, equity, and inclusion. You kind of have to have one superior over the other. And so I see people on LinkedIn all the time who are in the DEI industry, because it is an industry, talking about how the company that they work for are, not taking up certain initiatives that they're advocating for, and they're not doing this or doing that. And it's because the purpose of the company is to create a profit. If the trend continues, right, it kind of started with BLM, and then it's kind of turned into this DEI complex, And if that trend continues, then you're going to have organizations whose purpose is to advocate for DEI causes and then make a profit as a secondary concern.
Well, they're saying that DEI leads to increased profit
That's what they're
of the
saying.
companies.
Yes.
That's what they're saying.
That's
yeah.
what they're saying. And they're also quite self-interested in making that sure to be true. And I'm not so sure that that's true. In certain instances, yes, you can point to individual examples where diversity of opinions produces more valuable outcomes. But how is it actually being implemented? They're not actually out there advocating for, people with different opinions, as you just talked about with that Reuters guy.
Yeah. I'm not a fan of this industry.
I don't think they would hire you.
As a white, straight male.
I don't think you're going to be part of their career fair.
I've heard, I think
So-
if you were to apply to an Ivy League college as a white, straight male, you would not have been accepted. I think the statistics are 9 out of 10 white, straight males are either legacy, athletes or whatever other group. They're
Multiple
not.
gold medals.
Exactly.
It's
But that's how it starts, right? Like, is the objective to educate, or is it to promote an environment of diversity and inclusion? And I'm not putting a value judgment on that. I mean, for some people that's very important, but it changes the point of the institution. And so I think where you're going to see, and Jonathan Haidt talks about this too in his books, you're going to see two different kinds of institutions, one of which is going to be chasing after truth and education, and one's going to be chasing after diversity, equity, and inclusion, and they're not going to be going after the same thing. And the degrees from those are going to be different. I don't know what the end implications of those are, but I think that's kind of already happening.
But don't you think that the institutions that are now arising, that are trying to pursue the truth and education and meritocracy, are going to push the DEI institution in the same direction because they will outperform them?
So outperform them along what axis? Because they're not going to outperform them along the axis that the DEI institutions care about.
But
right, because
yeah, and this comes this is somewhat of a controversial.
Oh, that's
topic,
good.
Obviously.
Really, from you?
But so let me give you an example. This is something I thought like a long time ago when you and I were actually still in graduate school. Mm-hmm. There was, I forget which year it was, but there was a town hall meeting held in the physics department of the University of Texas here, and the chairman at the time was just presenting some updates of what's going on in the department, and some of the main task of the department is hiring new faculty, right, to make up for people retiring, and in the physics community at the time, and I assume it's still a big topic, was representation of women in the body of faculty in the science fields, and physics especially, because physics tends to probably still be primarily male, right? So at the time then, he was presenting some candidates that were up for evaluation for hiring, and I remember very distinctly one of the female graduate students, I shouldn't say her name anyways, but I remember one of the female graduate students standing up and like agitatedly shouting at the chairman in front of the entire town hall meeting that he should hire a woman. Right?
Yeah.
Okay. And then, I can understand her passion in the subject, and probably, thinking this through, of course, I'm not a woman and I can never understand a woman's perspective, but I can empathize that being in a field that's primarily dominated by males, it's probably difficult to then be successful and thrive and find peers to relate to and role models and so on. These are all real problems, right? But what I'm then thinking through is, well, okay, we're trying to now here assemble a body of faculty which are very rare individuals, right? We're trying to find the best of the best.
Such as you and I,
right? Like you and I, who became right. No, I'm not in this pool, right?
Yeah,
I'm not. Otherwise, I would hold one of these jobs, but I'm not. But these are very rare individuals, and so just if we're looking at anything else but their merit and their achievements in that domain that we're trying to maximize, which is, whatever subject in physics, we're going to lower the standard. By necessity, right? If we have a pool of applicants, the people that apply to physics faculty positions are postdocs, and by virtue of the physics community being primarily male, that pool will be, let's say, 90% male, 10% female. If we're now saying we're only going to select for a female candidate, by necessity, we're limiting that pool, and we have to, by that virtue, lower the quality, lower the standard. And again, I think this is the wrong point to make the adjustment. If you want to have a higher representation of women in the physics community, two things I want to say to that. Number one, you could try to attack this at the front end, right? Meaning you go to elementary school, middle school, and high school, and there you try to encourage female students to pursue their interests in that field, and thereby you'll increase the pipeline. You'll have more females in the pipeline, and then eventually in the faculty body, right?
Actually, the counter to that is who goes to the elementary schools to actually give this presentation to encourage women to do it? They're all men.
Yeah.
Right. And so you have men telling women, oh, it's really great for women, speaking as a man. And so that's why the people who advocate for hiring at the top, so those same people can then go back and sort of institute that change that you're advocating for.
Yeah.
So that is a subtlety, and it's difficult, right?
I get
it's
that,
kind of a question.
Yeah, I understand that. But again, I think you're trying to fix it on the wrong end.
Yeah.
And you're causing secondary problems that are not wanted and that will at some point show up. And the second thing I want to mention here, because this is something I actually learned from Jordan Peterson. It is a paper, and I can pull this up if you guys want to see it.
A peer-reviewed paper?
Peer review.
Oh, yeah. Otherwise, it's not real.
Exactly. Peer review.
It has to be looked at by experts, or it's not true.
It's truth. Every word of it. It's like the gospel. Yeah. So this was published in 2018 in Science. In this particular paper, they were looking at representation of gender in different fields in industry, right? Like nursing and engineering and so on, right? And then they were doing this for many different countries around the world. And then they were trying to look at correlations, and they were looking at two things to distinguish the countries. One, GDP, so economic development of the country, and how gender equal a country is. It's a little bit harder to define, but you can look at certain,
you can do it.
You could argue that Scandinavian countries are more gender equal than, Iran, right? And I think everyone would agree with that. So, and then what they found is that actually the higher the economic development and the higher the index of gender equality in the country, that actually correlates with maximizing the
economic growth.
No, it maximizes the difference in gender representation in the fields. That means the richer a country is and the more gender equal, they tend to have less diversity according to gender in the different professions. So more women go into nursing, less men. More men go into engineering, less women. If the country is more gender equal and higher in economic development. Why? This is counterintuitive, right?
It's really difficult to distinguish between fundamental or underlying discrimination and differences in choice. You want to have a society in which anyone can pursue any career or have the opportunity to pursue any career that they would like.
Yeah.
And you could say that there are sort of soft boundaries in the sense that, like, oh, I'm a man and I want to be a ballet dancer, and there's so few men in ballet, and maybe that plays a role in my decision making, and maybe that's true, and you could understand that. But then there's also hard, concrete boundaries that men can't go into ballet or women can't go into physics or whatever it is. So you want to eliminate as many of those hard boundaries as you can.
Yeah.
But you also want to be able to have people choose what they want to do and what they're interested in. And once you've achieved that point, if you achieve a disparity, how is that going to differ from a series of statistics from a country where you do have those concrete boundaries? It's very difficult to tell.
It is. But we have changed the goalpost, right? Because what you're describing was the previous goalpost that I very much support, right? We should remove these boundaries. We should help people that want to go into fields where maybe their gender or their race is underrepresented. But then we shouldn't force an equal outcome, which is what we're doing right now.
But then you point to the same like both sides point to the same statistics as evidence for their cause, right? Yeah. So that's why the discussion is so fruitless. So I don't know. It's a challenge.
Why do they point to the same? I don't understand that.
Like, well, maybe that's not quite true. But people who are advocating for equal representation of gender, for example, in engineering, point to the same statistics about how you have these giant disparity, right? And then you have the people on the other side say, well, yeah, there's a giant disparity in the countries that are more societally equal. So the outcome is similar in terms of the numbers that they're discussing, but then the goals are different.
Yeah,
right.
Sure. But what I'm arguing is that in a society that is more gender equal, has more equal opportunity for the different genders and races, the slight differences in interest maximize, right? Like you described. So there might exist some population differences in interest, and they can then maximize because individuals can actually do what they want to do without restraints from society, without economic restraints.
And that becomes most prominent when you get to the top 1%, right?
Sure.
Just because of statistics.
Yeah. So, and maybe that's going to change actually.
Yeah, it could.
Because that is not, it's not solid, right? These as a human species, we evolve, and maybe as we're pushing for this equity, maybe these differences in interest that exist between men and women right now and are well documented will disappear at some point as we evolve as a human species. And maybe then we'll stop reproducing and we'll die out. So I don't know.
So I had an idea that I wanted to go back to. So you were talking about our experience at UT and sort of the ways we saw this DEI stuff pop up. Yeah. And one example that came to mind for me was we had a presentation. I don't remember if you were here during this time. It might have been after you'd left. We had a presentation from a professor, and I forget which institution, who was talking about educational studies. So he wasn't presenting on physics data. He was talking about how we teach physics to different people. And I don't recall the age group, but it was elementary school, or maybe high school, but it was a younger age group. And the discussion was basically trying to figure out the source and ways to overcome the gender gap in physics. And so the idea is you have a traditional lecture class, and then you say, okay, in a traditional lecture, you get this distribution of test scores, and men's test scores tend to be higher than women in this particular age group for that particular method of teaching. And then they showed the numbers and everything. And then they said we actually adopted a different way of teaching physics, which is more group-oriented, more group projects, more sort of group tests that involves these interpersonal skills. And they wanted to see if that had a difference in the gender impact in terms of the disparity in scores. And they found that it almost completely eliminated the disparity, but everyone did worse on the test at the end of the year, which is a individual test, not a group test. And so I thought that was really interesting because the conclusion of the results was kind of like, oh, well, it's inconclusive and we'll see what we can come up with to try to, reduce this disparity. But I thought it was a really stark contrast between what are we trying to do as an institution at a university? Are you trying to teach physics, or are you trying to reduce the gender disparity because you couldn't do both with this particular teaching methods? And so the trend now is to sort of orient itself towards reducing the disparity as the highest good. Yeah. And so the institutions that are able to show that data, saying that all test scores are equal, and that's the data that everyone cares about, then those are going to sort of become the number one institutions. However, I hope they don't forget what they're actually supposed to be doing, which is teaching physics. And so how is that going to manifest itself? Is you're going to have engineering firms that are completely equal in terms of race and gender, building bridges that fall down. And that's when people are going to notice. Not to say that certain individuals don't have the ability or the knowledge, but when the purpose of that organization isn't to build a bridge, it's to maintain equity, you're not going to have the same quality on the bridge building side.
Yeah, and you're taking that to its logical conclusion. Yeah.
Right, and so just like the idea with the cops, right? It's like we're trying to solve this problem of excess tyranny in isolated incidences, and you solve that problem at the expense of the bigger problem. Yeah. And so we're confusing the purpose of that particular institution. And I think that when it's going to turn back, it's going to be because of catastrophic deficiencies on the actual original purpose.
Yeah, and it's going to hit us in the face because objective reality exists.
Unless you're one of those theoretical physicists who don't
laws
relate. It's
hopefully not going to cause big problems, but it might. And we also don't exist in a vacuum where there's not other countries around the world that might have different approaches, such as China, or...
So I'm glad you brought this up. So there's a strong sentiment, particularly in the Democratic Party, right? And you see it the same way here. There's a strong push to have diverse individuals hired to positions of power. And I'm not going to name any individuals, but there are clear individuals in the Biden administration that aren't particularly good at their jobs, who fulfill certain criteria.
Do they have the last name Biden?
I'm not going to say that because he's a white man.
Okay,
so he doesn't count.
So we can bash on him.
I think we
Yes,
can.
yes.
Yeah,
We
but
must,
But he
actually.
is old,
Yes.
and so that's ageist.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
But he's also the same.
I forgot.
But he's pretty much the same age as Trump, so it's not ageist to bash Trump.
Got it. Okay.
Anyways.
Okay.
But it plays a role there too, where in the highest institutions of government, where we're navigating complex things such as foreign policy, and you've got people put into roles not because of their ability to solve those problems, who theoretically should be the best of the best, not able to do their job as well as other candidates because they're not actually hired to do the job. They're hired to fulfill a certain quota.
Yeah.
And I think that's awful, and we're gonna see consequences of that.
Yeah, I agree. And again, it's like it starts out with good intentions and trying to solve a real problem, and ends undermining its own cause.
And it's because people forget the work that needed to take place in order to mostly solve a lot of those problems, right? And then you kind of have to go back to basics. So like, oh yeah, the reason we put good people in charge is because it's actually important that people can do their jobs and the lights stay on.
Right. Yeah.
Do you think that companies should be investing in helping educate young people to, then be more diverse as a result?
I think they should invest in educating young people to be competent in a field of study. What that field of study is, whatever it is, should be the goal. If the goal is to study social sciences and try to understand different disparities between race and gender, be the best at that, but understand that that is your job, not that in addition to being CEO of a company. And so if you're trying to educate people in terms of how to be the best physicist, teach them physics as best you can.
But do you think it's the responsibility of the company or the government?
And for what?
Right. If I'm an engineering firm and I build bridges and I want my company to be the best, but I also want to be diverse, I want more women to go into engineering, should it be my responsibility to train women to be the best engineers so they can then go work for me? Or should it be the government's responsibility?
I would say that if that is a goal of the private company, then it's completely up to them. So, which I guess puts the responsibility on the individual company. Now, I could see as a company who has to fund that particular job search or education, I could see them having the incentive to try to convince the federal government to do it.
Exactly.
And what I see even more likely is the federal government mandating it to individual companies. And so that's kind of a whole reversal of that particular question.
Which, by the way, is happening in Europe.
Oh, sure.
To some extent,
I'm not surprised.
Yeah.
But then that complicates the goal of the company, which is to build bridges. And so it's not the way to do it. You kind of have to have one purpose.
Yeah. Let's talk about peer reviews. We touched upon it. But there's this specific case of Peter Boghossian that was testing the waters of how far he can go with peer-reviewed articles. And I think it was back in 2017 when he published this peer-reviewed piece on gender, and I think he was saying that like penis is not an organ and it's a social construct, and he like completely made everything up. Everything was made up, and it was published in a lot of like well-regarded publications, right? And that just points to the fact of these publications are so biased, and it's very difficult to get your work published if you're not conforming to the ideology and the movement.
I would say that's not even necessarily the bias exists, true, but if you're a peer reviewer and you think a certain way and you read a paper that already sort of confirms what you already believe, you're not going to be as critical of it. This has come up several times, just like with the CNN article with face masks, right? If you're presented with data that contradicts something that you think to be true, you're going to be much more likely to go attack it. So in this particular instance, Peter Boghossian basically came up with a bunch of nonsense conclusions, but we're still in line with some of the intuitions and biases of the people in the peer review. And therefore, they sacrifice some of their expertise in attacking such papers because it already aligned with what they had to say. So I think that was the whole point that he was pointing out, is that not only are they biased, but they're actually worse at their job when they're presented with information that already kind of confirms what they believe. And that's, I think, a hugely important thing for citizens of the 21st century to recognize. When you watch a news organization, you feel this incentive to either strongly agree or strongly disagree with it. And it's easy to strongly disagree with something, because then you can come up with all these facts about why you believe the way you believe and all that stuff. But we need to train ourselves in order to encounter information that we strongly agree with and still try to attack it with the same intensity that the information that we already disagree with would. Because otherwise, without that, I think we're just going to continue to get more Fox News and CNNs or Republican Twitter and Democrat Twitter, and then that's going to spiral out of control. But I really enjoyed that whole article that he wrote and all these different peer-reviewed journals that he got published. And the only criticism they had was that he faked data, which is pretty weak. Even though technically true, he didn't actually do all the experiments he said he was going to do. But yeah, I thought that was ridiculous.
Yeah.
I love that point that you make, to try to steelman the other side in order to understand it better and also to understand your own point better.
Yep.
But I was just also thinking, what can we do to fix the peer review process? So just to review how it currently works, right? There's a lot of weird aspects of it where, researchers will tackle a certain problem, come to, form hypotheses, test them, collect some data, and then come to some conclusion, write up a publication about it, send it to these
bunch of publications,
these big journals, right, that act somewhat as a gatekeeper to information. That has also always been a strange aspect about it, that while much of the research is government funded, it is not accessible to individuals freely. Often it's behind a paywall. There are some other people tackling that, and you can still find the papers illegally, but it is officially behind a paywall. And journals are profiting hugely of publishing these papers. And in order to get published in the paper, you have to clear a few stages. First, the editor has to, for whatever reason, find it interesting enough. That's the first stage, which is already, there is some argument for it. But also, if you're just doing maybe boring research that's important and true, why should it not get published? And a lot of criticism in the community centered around these big journals of nature and science that are, some I've heard some professors making the joke, like, just because it's published in Nature, it doesn't mean it's wrong, right? Because there's so many instances where something looked flashy on the outside, and it was the cutting edge research, and Nature wanted to publish it, but then later on turned out, well, actually certain aspects of it could not be reproduced, and actually the conclusions pointed in a different direction. But yeah, point being, so there's the first stage of the editor of the journal, and then there's the peer reviewing process, which again is like is supposed to act like as a quality filter, right, to the research
by experts in the field.
By experts in the field, which are also, and that's has its own complications, because it's usually people in your community. These communities tend to be very small, on the order of hundreds of people. So you probably know each other. You're probably also sometimes competitors. You have your own self-interests to maybe not let your competitor publish for you or in a higher quality journal, and so on and so forth. So I was just thinking, this might be one of the perfect places for AI to have a positive impact and completely unwind this archaic system. Let information be freely published, which of course then makes the quality check much more difficult, but build systems based on AI that can perform this quality check, summarize huge bodies of literature, and let that study and review happen in a much better way.
That displaces the role of the expert with AI, which means the AI has to be expert in everything, which it might eventually turn into that, but that's a little bit scary, right?
What I'm thinking right now is just build AI systems as tools to allow people to do that, right? Because right now it's already to the point where if you wanted to, let's say you want to learn about a new subject that you haven't been studying for years, you want to review the body of literature, it's impossible.
Right.
It's impossible. There's so much, you wouldn't know where to start, and so you have to go by these kind of outward signals of okay, this is published in a high impact factor journal, so I'm going to start with those, or I'm going to look for some key opinion leaders in the field. I'm going to look at their publications. But then, by virtue of that, you're already out ruling out a bunch of good information. And so that's where AI could help.
And the more recent and the more cutting edge the technology is, the less valuable all these publications become, because it's all these competing interests. So if you're saying, okay, what's true, what's false, it's unknown, because that's the way science works. So you just have to have this fight between different data sets, and so just getting that conclusion is really difficult. Another point I wanted to make about peer review is this editor the first step of getting the editor to look at it can also be circumvented by personal relationships. You could have gone to graduate school with the editor and you say, hey, buddy, like you're the editor, you want to take a look at my paper? Chances are pretty good he'll pass it on.
The submission is supposed to be anonymous, right? Or it is anonymous?
Not to the editor you usually know, right? Of
right.
the journal, because they are on the website, but the peer review, sometimes it's double blinded, where they blind the authors of the paper and they blind the name of the peer reviewer to the authors. But again, these fields are so niche.
Yeah.
The reviewers will oftentimes look at the research and know, okay, I know this guy I met at a conference. Their lab is doing this research, right? So yeah.
And then another thing is the editors, first of all, aren't paid super well to do this job well, and the peer reviewers basically aren't paid at all. So there's very few financial incentives to say, hey, if you do a really good job, you'll get a bigger paycheck. And it's kind of like, no, it's like a duty that you have to do, or a service that you provide for very little pay. So there's not a lot of incentive to really go back and really pick apart these data sets in order to understand the truth and the nuance of that particular paper. So it's not the best system, but it's still not a terrible system. No. But when people talk about peer review journal, it's kind of like, oh, if it's not peer reviewed, then it's not true. It's like, well, that's not necessarily true either, right?
Yeah, that's not.
So who does the peer review? Is it PhDs?
It's other professors.
Yeah, other professors.
Yeah. So the editor of the journal will take the paper, and if they decide to send it to peer review, they will try to find other professors in either the same or similar fields and then send it to them. And so every professor is publishing as their duty, also does some peer review on the side.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And how does the actual peer review work? Like, what are you looking for?
Just the quality of the data, quality of the methods. You say, this is what we did, this is the results that we found. A lot of times people try to make claims based on data that are too strong. Based on the results they gathered, they can't quite make that conclusion, and the peer reviewer is supposed to point that out. And so then you have to walk back your claim. So rather than saying that's true every time, you can only say that's true in this particular organism or something along those lines.
And is the peer review a paper on its own, or is that a quantifiable score?
The way they score it, I think, varies journal to journal, but they do give you feedback, and usually multiple paragraphs and stuff. But just to give an example, let's say that guy at Reuters put together his data that he found and wanted to publish it. He would have to get through an editor and a peer review process, and there's pretty good incentive in that sense to not be the editor that let that particular information come to light, right? And so just because it's not peer reviewed in that case on such a charged topic doesn't necessarily mean that it's not true. But what they should do, right, rather than say we're not even going to look at this, is say here's the problems with that particular data set, and actually have that discussion and give him an opportunity to say, hey, well, I actually took that into consideration by this, and this, and to some degree that discussion could be a public discussion. In peer review, typically it's just between you and the reviewers because the topics tend to be pretty niche and esoteric. But in that case, that would be a great public discussion to have.
Sometimes I think there's some journals which publish the entire back and forth between the reviews themselves,
like group chat.
Yep.
Yeah, because the reviewers will receive the paper, they'll write their own 2 to 10 pages, and then some journals publish all of this, but others don't. So
but it is funny how, like you said, it's such a small community. If you know that so and so is working on a similar project and he doesn't like this kind of microscopy, and then the reviewer says, this is a bad project, and then you're using the wrong kind of microscopy. Like, who it is, and you're like, John, cut it out.
So does the number of peer reviews determine the quality of the paper?
You mean the number of reviewers?
Score? Yeah. Or is it the score that they get?
No, so depending on the journal, it'll be 2 to 4 reviewers per paper. And then, as far as I know, the processes I've been involved in, the reviewers will either say, do not publish because it has, for whatever reason, big flaws, big omissions of data, or publish, but only after these certain things are addressed, and then they'll make a list of this paragraph needs to be rewritten here. Citations of seminal papers in the past have been omitted and need to be included. Also, my paper, by the way, you need to cite myself, right? The reviewer will say. Or oftentimes control experiments are requested. So this data is great, but I would like for you to please do these and these experiments as a control to make the claims of that data even stronger. And then, or the third category would be publish no revisions, right? Or minor revisions. And it'll just be a few words here and there. And usually you'll be in the middle there somewhere, and then you'll try to address all of that. You do address it. Sometimes you go back to the lab for a couple months, take some more data, then you send it out again. It goes back to the same reviewers, and then they decide again, did that address my concerns or not? And then that can sometimes go back and forth a few times.
It can take years to get like a really high profile paper.
Yeah, it's usually at least in physics, it's usually on the order of a year.
Yeah.
This process. That's why these servers that I don't know when archive started originally. I think it came from Cornell University, where these preprint servers. So we're some researchers. I wish I knew who started archive originally, but started just a website, just a server to deposit papers once they were finished and written.
But not peer reviewed.
And not peer reviewed, but at the same time as the professor was sending it to the journal, would also deposit it here and saying to the community, hey, I finished this paper. I'm going to start on the review process now, but here, read the raw version so you know already what I found. Yeah. And you can make your own, decisions for your research.
So other people can review as well, not just the two.
Well, they can read it and sort of understand the methods. But I think the reason it exists is so that certain professors can say, I discovered this first.
Well, that's another view to make claim on who did it first.
And that matters. I mean, a couple years ago, there was a Nobel Prize in physics for this particular substance that I won't go into. And then the first 3 people to create it in the lab all got Nobel Prizes. And the 4th is a professor at UT Austin. And he still remembers this particular Nobel Prize. Because, had he put that paper on archive, he might have been able to shake that up or just, push his grad students a little bit harder. So that kind of thing could be important.
Yeah. But overall, the positive side of that is that this information is accessible faster. And first, I think archive was started first, and then now we have bioarchive, which is more in the life sciences papers, and I think that got a lot of press now around the issue of COVID. So in general, it is I think a really good platform for information to be accessible faster without that delay of a year before it goes through the process, but with the caveat of knowing, hey, the final version of the paper might include some additional data. It might have some of the conclusions watered down a bit because, the data doesn't support the strong conclusion or whatever. But I think overall it's a good thing. So
can the paper be used while it's in archive before the official publication for citations?
Yes and no. Well, it again depends on the journal. You can cite a preprint, but I think, I'm not 100% sure of this, but I think some journals have their own rules about what you can cite and not cite. And some journals might have a rule against that. So you cannot cite a preprint, but I'm a little iffy about that. So
that is kind of a niche application, but
yeah.
It's interesting. Cool. What else do you disagree on? Free speech.
I think we've
mental health
and disagreed about the same proportion. I don't know.
A topic that I recently stumbled upon, not stumbled upon, but that's becoming more and more in my conscious, and just as a side comment, right? As human beings, we have selective focus, right?
Sure.
And so we only perceive what we focus on, and so I'm about to become a father here in a few short weeks. Woo. And so I'm focusing more on the topic of family and children, and so suddenly I see a lot of pregnant women running around in the city, which I never noticed before, and a lot of people with strollers. Like, where did you guys all come from? So that's kind of funny. But just looking at the statistics around families and reproduction and children, Elon Musk talked about this publicly some time ago, and I think Jordan Peterson recently as well, that there's a big gap between the number of people that want to have children and the number of people that actually do have children. And currently we are below replacement rate in the society, which I believe is roughly 2.1 children per woman in a society, to keep up with people dying and of natural unnatural causes. And that, of course, presents a lot of problems.
Yeah, specifically, that 0.1 kid is really difficult to really get on that.
I want to quote. This is from. I want to quote Jordan Peterson here. He said something like, "Yeah, it's really hard to have the first kid, But then, once you have one, the number two is a little bit easier. By the time you have 2 kids, you're screwed anyway, so you might as well have 3. And then from number 4 onwards, the kids start taking care of themselves and kind of as a community.
Right.
I found that kind of funny, so I'll report back in a few years if that's true or not. Yeah. But but it's so what happened. So why I find this so interesting is because you can look at it from a lot of different perspectives, right? Like one is that I want to call it a lie that we're telling young people. It's a very strong term, but a story that we're telling young people that I believed for a long time. The story of having time, the story of needing to party, the story of needing to sleep and date around, the story of you can do it later when you figured it out. And what I'm talking about is building a family and having children, and that's something I somewhat subscribed to and believed, and have only recently come around and learned, like, actually, having a family is what else are you going to do in life? It is something like of such high value that none of these other things compare, right? Like sleeping around or partying or even economic career success, which I value still very high, but I'm now coming to realize that it might not be even on the same level.
Well, for career success, right? It's like you want to be successful in your career. For what? For why?
Yeah.
What problem is it that you're trying to solve? You could be in a position, CEO of a big company, president of an organization, or politician, or whatever. Where your work you're doing is really quite important, and the fact that you're working all the time is actually almost required. There are very few positions that are like that. And so for people who aren't in those roles, I think it's true that they would get much more value about having a job that is able to be satisfying and give them opportunities to grow and be challenged, but also be able to work for their family or for their community or whatever that means to them.
Right.
So I kind of agree with that. But for some people, I mean, and those are the people that are at the top tier positions at law firms and physicians or politicians. Then it makes a certain amount of sense. But to think that you're one of those and then find out that you're not is not a good situation, right?
Yes. Yeah, because that's not the majority of people.
Right.
And also something that I wasn't realizing as much before is that how much fertility, and just focusing on the biological aspect here, right? How much fertility drops around the age of 30 for both men and women, and for women that happens faster, but also for men it starts dropping, and just your chances of having a child goes down dramatically.
Naturally. Conceiving
yes.
naturally.
And maybe at some point, unfortunately, I can see society getting to the point of saying, we should really fix this, and we should really build these like birthing robots or whatever.
It's happening. Artificial wombs. There's a lot of research going into it.
Yeah, I want nothing to do with that. But
I don't think they're going to volunteer you.
But so
I'm predicting that humans will not have sex 100 years from now. And there will be no pregnant women. It's all going to be done artificially. CRISPR editing will play a role. I think we will start editing genes. We will start creating super babies.
I wish I could disagree with you, but seeing what my wife is going through right now, just changes to her body and certain pains and discomfort, it is on a level that neither she nor I had imagined, and she's not having any abnormal complications. This is all normal stuff, but is very uncomfortable. So I can totally see that. Like, we're gonna move that direction, unfortunately.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of wealthier women these days are hiring surrogate mothers to carry their babies because they don't want to go through the discomfort, right? Because they have careers and they're busy and they're stressed and they don't want to put that pressure on the child. Do you think that's good? Do you think that's bad?
Well, I think it is.
Where are we going with this?
It is an interesting problem because like you said, they're too busy. They've got their careers. And a lot of that is very true in the sense that you kind of need 2 incomes for most jobs, right? For most salaries in order to sort of afford raising a kid or raising multiple children. And so that's also plays a role in all this, right? And so how do we get to the point where two incomes are necessary, so both parents have to work, and so any sort of children that are produced, if they're produced, don't really get the benefit of having both parents around in the way that they need. And what kind of children are those going to grow up to be?
Yeah.
And we're kind of in the early stages of finding that out, right? As the prevalence of two income households is increasing over time. And that's not to say that people shouldn't have careers or anything along those lines, but to have it be a more feasible option to have one person generate most of the income and another person stay home, whether that's the man or the woman, I won't make that judgment. But when that's no longer an option, there are negative effects on the upbringing of the child, and I don't think we understand what those are. And you have to really make it a priority to care for that child in that particular situation, because you really don't have the time during your work hours. And so in your free time, you really have to put that extra effort in, and I think that's difficult for a lot of people to do.
Yeah.
So why do people
Absolutely.
not want children? Do you think it's because of the economic situation? It's just very expensive? Or do you think it's because of comfort? People like freedom. They like to go on vacations. They like to devote more time to career.
Well, I think all of that plays a role, certainly. But then, like Emanuel kind of alluded to, as you get a little bit older and more mature, such as this guy, you start to value things a little bit differently, right?
Yeah.
And so you know, when you've lived 20 years, you say, oh, there's so much more life. I haven't tried this kind of alcohol. I haven't gone to this kind of party.
Mm-hmm.
I've only been to one rave. You know, all these things. And as you get a little older, and some of the experiences that you go through are not bringing the same value that they used to. And so you kind of say, well, what else is there? Oh, there's your career. So you can devote yourself to your career and really jump into that. And you do that for a while, and then you kind of say, well, am I going to do this for 30 years and then die and that's it? So there's I think a search for something that they find more meaningful, and that's I think where that question is going to turn around. And so then that begs the question, well, economically, what sacrifices do you have to make in terms of your free time? Clearly, there's going to be sacrifices, but how much and in what direction and in what way? And then also, do you have a partner that's sufficiently supportive in both your dreams to be a parent and also someone who works in your career? And that's a big issue because people are different individuals and they've got all sorts of biases. And there's lots of couples who are one person's much more self-focused and unwilling to sacrifice their time or their career for someone else, whether that's their partner or their child. And so how can we create a culture in which there's more equality between those two people, but also understanding that both people are going to have to sacrifice significantly in order to bring a child into the world, or two or three?
I think we need more government incentives to have children.
Government incentives.
So coming from ex-communist Czechoslovakia, we have this legacy socialist system, right? We have public health care, and we have a lot of support for mothers. And in the Czech Republic, we have 3 years of paid maternity leave. So it's very common for women to stay at home for 3 years with their babies. And then we have kindergarten after that, which is free. And then you have school after that, which is also free, right? And then after school is like very cheap. So there's always this support for women to, put their babies somewhere.
Sure.
And I just don't see that in the United States.
So I agree with the recognition that is a problem that should be solved. I disagree that the government is per se the best solution to that particular problem, and I'm not sure that I have a better one. But I whenever you say the word free, right, that just means that it's paid for by someone else or by the public in some sort of distributed
taxes,
and diffuse way. But then you also have the question of what is the quality of the childcare? What is the quality of the education? Who's making the decisions about that education? From the state's perspective, it is clearly in the state's interest to have couples have a certain number of children. So that makes sense to sort of provide those resources. But it's also in the state's interest to have people think a certain way or have people raised a certain way. And if, for example, you want to raise your child a certain way and that conflicts with that of the state, well, that's who's going to win that particular fight. And that's not a situation that I'm particularly a huge fan of. But also just from a purely economic perspective, when you have sufficient taxation in order to afford these services, the end result is actually more expensive and less efficient than if you were to have couples who are able to sort of be aware that long-term that was the goal that they wanted. And so rather than having tax burdens, they allocate their finances appropriately in order to be able to pay for these services. But I mean, that's obviously an imperfect solution too, because then you're saying, well, it's on the parents' responsibility, and there's lots of parents who just don't have that ability. Yeah. So then you have that bottom segment in which can't afford childcare, they can't afford education, and that's not good for the child either. So it's not a good solution, and government is one solution. I don't think it's the best one, but I also don't really have a good alternative.
Yeah. If you look at the trend, it's actually the rich people that don't have children.
I believe
right?
it.
Like
yeah.
the poor people have plenty of children.
Yep.
The rich don't have children.
Why?
They like their comfort.
Because
I don't know.
that destroys the economic argument. Right?
So there's a couple of things here that I think is important, right? So big picture, like you want to talk about like global problems. Eventually, the number of people is going to reach a certain number where it becomes unsustainable on the planet. Fight about the number. You disagree at all?
Yes.
Okay. Well,
I think we're very far from that.
I wouldn't.
Very far.
I'm not picking a number.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay.
So
of course.
Right.
If you have 1 trillion people, the Earth wouldn't be able to sustain it.
Right.
Yeah.
So there's some point in which that's going to be true. And so one way in order to solve, pick your global problem, climate change, sustainability, lack of resources, whatever it is. One way to solve it is to have some sort of plateau in global population. How do you have a plateau of global population that doesn't rely on something like genocide? Because obviously that's not a great solution. And one way to do it, I think, would be to have as many people get as wealthy as possible as quickly as we can. And I think that's the most humane solution to that particular problem. And so on like a global scale, what can we do in order to sort of encourage that? And I think we're already seeing it. You look at poverty rates globally for the last 15 years, and they've been cut in half or something ridiculous. I forget that statistic. But I think from like 1980 to 2015, the global poverty has been cut in half. And whether that's capitalism or globalism, I'm not going to make any claims there. But I think that's the right direction to be able to say, okay, we're going to have a population that is relatively stable at some certain number, and then you just have to develop systems in which to maintain that population, and then the drag on the resources is going to equal the sort of contribution back into the resources that humans can provide. That took it a little bit of a different direction, perhaps.
But if you look at the evidence, you're saying that wealth is going to help sustain our population. Well, it's not doing that now because wealthy people are not having children.
So there's
and financial incentives are not helping.
That's true, and there's a couple of competing factors, right? So it's important for some people to have children in order to maintain a certain population. But as we get,
everyone,
right? But as we get to a certain medical technology, people are also going to be living longer, right? So we're going to have these weird demographic shifts where the number of people isn't decreasing so quickly because people are living longer. But then you're going to get like,
then who's going to support the old people?
Right, you're going to have a lot of people, and we're going to see a taste of that with the baby boomer generation, and we're all going to pay the price for that, whether that means we don't get Social Security or whatever it is, and so that's clearly an issue, but. I don't know. I think that the way you balance that out is you maybe do provide some sort of incentives, but not necessarily government incentives, but more like cultural incentives, right? You create an environment in which it's expected that's something that you will do as a social good, right? We all have these sort of social goods that we agree are good things and good ways to act, and one of those could be, be sure to have kids and take good care of them, because otherwise the world's going to die or something, And that's not really something that we have because, variety of reasons.
The cultural incentives, unfortunately, are in the other direction, right?
Yeah, and it always sounds silly because when you're an anti-government guy and you don't think government solution generally is the best, the other answer always sounds really silly. It's just you need to create it. It's like, well, how are you going to do that, right?
Yeah, exactly.
But if you can do that, then that is a much more efficient solution.
Why do you think, though? Because what Lucy just said, I still don't understand. I think it's a very interesting question, because as people get richer, and especially I think the correlative factor is as women get more educated, and that correlates with wealth, and that tends to correlate with less children. So why does that happen?
So you want to have the best opportunities available for your kid, right? Mm-hmm. That each kid is going to cost a lot of money in order to sort of give them those opportunities.
Right.
So I think you can make a really good financial argument that when you have more kids, you're not able to spend as much money per kid in order to make sure that they have the opportunities that are available to them.
But then why do rich people have less children?
Because they spend more and more money on the children that they do have. Because the standards of like that particular like top tier wealthy family rat race are so high, where you have to have the best SAT course, and you have to have the best college prep classes, and you have to go to the best pre-kindergarten to middle school to high school to college, that the economic burden becomes so great that even wealthy parents can't afford that for multiple kids.
No, I think one argument for that is you don't need children to take care of you. A lot of people, especially poor families, have children because they want them to take care of them when they're older. right? Rich people don't
Yeah,
need that.
I guess that's
They
true.
will be able to take care of themselves.
That's a good point.
And the other argument from a women's perspective is, like 100 years ago, women were dependent on their husbands, like fully. Their whole life was around their family, and their role was to give birth. Like their whole purpose was about giving birth and having children, right? These days, women are independent, they're emancipated. They don't need to depend on a husband for a living, for a house, for anything else. So they just don't have the need to have children, and they're delaying it until they're too old to have them.
And that's, I get that. And,
Yeah.
Obviously those are, a lot of good aspects there, right? To allow women to more freely pursue their interests, removing some of these restrictions. But I think that is a sad effect.
On family.
What's that?
It's a negative effect on family formation, right?
Oh, yeah.
When women are independent, men are independent, there's less incentive to get together.
Absolutely.
Have a family.
And
not,
here's
not just that, but if you were to have children, there's still not that incentive to put the effort into raising the child in a way that you believe to be good and sustainable.
Yeah. One aspect that I learned a while ago and kind of find interesting in this realm, and I want to get you guys' opinion on that, is when it comes to family formation and finding a partner. When you look at that in parallel with the development of women becoming more educated, more emancipated, more free to pursue their interests. There is this concept out of the social sciences called hypergamy, and that you guys are probably familiar with.
I'm not. What is it?
It describes the behavior by human females to, in their partner choosing process, to either date across or up in the status hierarchy. So meaning, and status is very contextual, so it can mean money, but it doesn't have to. So meaning women tend to want to find a partner that's on their level or higher when it comes to certain status signals and factors. And as women rise in society and hold positions of power, positions of high status, that by necessity limits their dating pool severely, right? Mm-hmm. Because few of these people exist.
Yep.
What does that mean?
One possible solution, right, is for men to get their act together, trying to compete in that realm of status, right?
But if we have
I know statistics.
If we have a diverse
parity,
society,
right? If we have parity and equality of outcome, right, and we have like a 50-50 split, let's say, for sake of argument, and men are not guided by this, and they have no problem dating someone below them, quote unquote, in status, but women do, then women always limit themselves to whoever is above them, which the higher you rise, is less and less, and that kind of hurts men and women alike.
It does, but I don't really have a problem with that incentive of trying to get people to better themselves on the status hierarchy. Right?
I'm not saying I have a problem with it. I just find it an interesting fact.
Yeah, it will be certainly a readjustment. I mean, and this also assumes that the hypergamy is like a stone cold fact, which I know it's an observed trend, but how that holds itself in the next 20 years is kind of an open question, because there's been a lot of changes in the relationships between the genders in the last 40 years.
Absolutely, and that'll be fascinating, because I think this hypergamy, hypergamous, trend of behavior is somewhat, innate to our biology. But then, as we change society, human beings evolve, and maybe that changes.
Yeah, but was it going to evolve on the scale of
the
couple
time
decades?
Scale is, the time scale is interesting.
Yeah, there will be some tension in that. I think.
I think the solution is to find a partner early on when you're both kind of at a lower social status, and then rise up together.
What's happening right now along those lines, what I also find super interesting. So we're located here next to a college campus, right? Of 50,000 students, something like that. And if you look at the numbers of students, I think I looked it up yesterday. It's like 15. This is in the year of 2021. It was 15.9 million students in the U.S., undergraduate students. And out of those, it was something like close to 60% were female and 40% were male. So we're having like a 60-40 split now on college campuses, right? Which, what does that lead to, right? I mean, we know somehow that in the behavior, and this is like I'm discussing this like removed from the individual, right? This is like on the population level, and
Sure.
I'm also not inflicting here my judgment in any way, but it is in a way true that in a community where there's more women than men of reproductive age, or young women and men, there tends to be more competition amongst the women, and women tend to be more open to short-term sexual encounters, which men are seeking, and that kind of drives both away from long-term partnership formation, where in a community where there's slightly more men, it tends to cause more long-term partnerships. If there's too many men, then they start killing each other, I guess. It's a whole nother problem. But it's kind of an interesting development. Likewise, when you look at the economic front, like this thing of the wage gap is discussed very often, and I hate how it's misrepresented, but it is true now that in I think it was like 10 U.S. Urban areas, for people under the age of 30, women now out-earn men. And so that's a trend that's happening right now.
Sure.
Yeah.
On this sixth, yeah.
I guess the question I'm asking, right, is like, are we like with so many issues in society where there's, a real problem, and then we try to fix it. We push so hard that the pendulum is swinging like in the other direction. Is this what's happening right now?
Or that could be you got to look at a bunch of different factors, right? It's not like the fact that we're pushing for women in engineering is the source of all these problems or anything like that, right? There's clearly a lot of factors.
Yeah.
Some of it has to do with just the rising independence of women, that there's a lot of things that are at play. But it still begs the question, what's the outcome? And what new problems are going to pop up that we haven't really had to deal with?
Yeah. This is why I find this so fascinating.
Yeah.
And how does that affect family formation, right?
And then you also
having children.
just see silly things like, how many guys would rather stay home and play video games?
All.
Clearly, especially as video games get really good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But that is kind of a sad side effect of that, because as women rise in status and they limit their dating pool, they want nothing to do with men like below them.
And then they're just saying like, we can't even compete. Why even try? But if I create a virtual avatar, I can do whatever I want,
Yeah.
And they can go be the hero in their virtual world or whatever.
But I think on the 60-40 stats, a lot of women do get college degrees, but they then don't end up in the workforce, especially women in the upper middle class.
Is that because they're choosing to, or is it because of the
They're choosing to.
sexism?
Yes, I think in America, the traditional family culture is very prominent as opposed to Europe, right? Like in my country, no woman is a housewife. The concept pretty much does not exist in Czech Republic.
Yeah.
In America, if you can afford it, you stay at home. Like a lot of women choose to stay at home, right? So even though they do get educated, they earn a college degree, they choose to not work eventually. And I think that's a shame.
Well, it's their choice, right?
It's their choice.
Yeah.
It's their choice. Yeah.
But why is this? I don't think it's a negative thing per se. I think it's a positive thing that more women are getting college degrees, are getting educated.
True, but if they don't use it in any way, in any positive way.
Who's to say they don't use it? If just because they don't join corporate America, right? There's many other ways to contribute, having been educated and tackling societal problems in different ways than joining corporations.
They don't have to join corporations, but I think contributing to the workforce is important. And then if she doesn't, she's dependent on the husband again, which causes a lot of issues. It leads to violence against women. It leads to abuse in the relationship. And there are statistics on that.
I'm really reluctant to implement policies that contradict the ability for people to make choices.
Yeah.
So you might disagree with the choices of individuals. Boy, we could talk about that all day.
Yeah.
But trying to change that in some sort of authoritarian way, I think is really dangerous.
I think changing the culture is the answer. Not changing the law, but changing the culture before.
I'm not so sure that I'm not so sure that I think that that's necessarily required. I think that if, for example, more men stayed at home and more women went into the workforce, like that wouldn't necessarily be a problem, right?
It would.
Why?
Because I'm all for equality.
If they chose to stay at home. But that's what I'm saying. It is equality.
I say
If an equal proportion of men stayed home as women stayed home and take care of the kids.
Okay.
Right. Why is that a bad thing? If it's their choice
I
and they're able to.
I am all for economic growth. And I think if people do stay at home, that has an impact, negative impact on that.
How about the difference between short-term economic growth, which is everyone works all the time, and long-term economic growth, which is having some people work in the present in order to raise the workers of the future, shall we say?
I think we should implement flexible solutions so that both parents can be at home, raise their children while contributing to the workforce, right? So doing something in between where you're not completely outside of the workforce, but you're not also spending 12-hour days at work. Maybe. Which is not possible for everyone.
I think on a population level, you're going to get the same thing if you allow for the people to choose, right? You can have those high-powered 12-hour-a-day individuals working those hours, generating that economic output, and you can also have the people stay at home 100% of the time. So in terms of national economic output, the end result is the same. But you have a lot more heterogeneity in the sample. Yeah. You have a lot more different people making different choices. And because of the freedom of personal choice and lack of government intervention, it's actually a very efficient system for that to happen.
Yeah.
What I would like to see is, as you know, over the last decades, the individual in the workforce has gained in their productivity, in what they can output, right, with the amount of time spent. But somehow we're not spending less time at work. Yeah. Even though our output has increased. Maybe we can at some point reach a level where we can be so efficient that we can spend more time with our families. I would like to get to a place where you can actually, at least one person in the couple can stay home for the initial years of the child. If not both, can be more involved, like you described, some kind of a flexible solution, because it's so important. And I don't want to have my child be the entire day or majority of the day with some strangers in a daycare, so I can stare at a 13-inch computer screen until my head hurts and I want to slam the laptop on the concrete, right? So,
well, that's the utopia of communism, right? Having people do whatever they want in their free time, having all of time being your free time, right? And all the work being automated. That's I think that's where we're getting with AI and work automation. Yeah.
Maybe. I think that'll be unsatisfactory for most people.
It will.
Yeah.
It will.
It'll present a lot of different problems.
Yeah.
This was fun.
Yeah. Thanks so much for the invitation.
Well, thank you so much, guys. And hopefully I'll see you next time.
Yeah, absolutely.